Oh, okay.
All right. Yuri, welcome.
Hello.
Welcome,
Thanks.
everybody. My fault for not starting. We totally could have started at 11, but it's all my fault for some technical difficulties here. Yuri has been patiently waiting. And yeah, very happy to talk with you, Yuri. Little Ukrainian spotlight here this morning. So yeah, why don't you introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about how things are going for you?
Oh, hello. My name is Yuri. As we just said, I'm probably one of the most well-spoken antisocial people on this planet. Right, but I was actually born like it's. I was born. Well, I usually say I was born in USSR, and when people say, "Well, the USSR is it Union of Soviet Socialist Republics?" and I say, "No, it was a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic." So a lot of my, time, a lot of my viewing things kind of comes from by that background. So I clearly understand the difference. For example, when people go like, "Oh, like the Soviet Union was like this," and you go like, places were different. But I also moved. I actually lived in Ukraine through the 30 years of independence, but I also lived in England, Belgium, Netherlands, France, Germany. I lived in Switzerland for a while, so kind of moved around Europe. And to be honest, I'm not a great YouTuber. I had ran my YouTube channel, and one of the main purpose for it was like I wanted to learn to speak, and I never scripted any of my videos. That's why they're kind of boring. But
I'm not a
I
great
think,
YouTuber either. Don't worry.
yeah, but I think one of the things is like by writing to you and saying, "Hey, let's have a chat." I think it's like what I would like to achieve the most is say, "Hey, there are Ukrainian voices out there, and they almost never heard." Like in the last couple of months, there's been a couple of situations where they brought Ukrainians on a couple of channels, but over the last years, I have heard people talk on behalf of Ukraine and like saying, "Hey guys, this is happening, that's how we think." But there's almost never Ukrainians that you can comment. There's a lot of channels coming in. They would bring in the like their big new Russian friends, which will talk about how we should love Russia and things like this. And there's almost never Ukrainians. And also a lot of people you hear them they write books about like situations in Ukraine, and you go, "Do you even speak Russian?" I mean, I'm not asking you to speak Ukrainian, but come on, guys, at least somebody who can speak Russian, at least somebody who can go and there's a lot of open videos that, on YouTube that you can go and watch. There's plenty of programs where you can go and watch and people you can listen to and say, "Hey, that's the situation there." It's like, but you hear nothing of that. So my kind of like when I wrote to you, I said like, look, my view on certain things are probably going to be different from even many Ukrainian people because of my background, where I have left Ukraine when I was still quite young, and although I kept in touch with Ukraine, you know, I have like, well, I wouldn't say great friends, but people who we're very friendly with in different areas of life in Ukraine, including like a couple of journalists and some people I've met from which are from Ukraine that come to, for example, to Germany and they stay in Germany, they stay in other places. So it's kind of that kind of view, and sometimes certain things I will say it's easier for me to say because I am not actually I have not had to live through the actual experience of war. So it's like I did not have a missile drop in like a very good friend of mine. I usually call her my little sister, and right, she was leaving, and then she's like, when the war just started, she was showing a video of like a Russian missile essentially landing like one building away from theirs. And that time they were like lucky-ish because they didn't hit the actual building. It fell in the yard in like a courtyard. So there's like multi-story buildings. But I didn't have to live through that. So a lot of times it's a bit easier for me to say about certain things and keep like a bit more level head. But nevertheless, it's like I'd like to hear more Ukrainians being brought over and like people actually talking to Ukrainians instead of like having some guy who's like, okay, have you been there? Like, I mean, sometimes it's also like, oh, I'm grateful that you're speaking on behalf of Ukrainians, but then it's like yourself as a American officer, ex-officer, like Ryan Macbeth, you probably seen a couple of his shows,
Yeah, we interviewed him
right?
actually.
Yeah, it's like so, and you go like, okay, guys, you're doing like, but sometimes it's like, okay, this, can I share a screen?
Yep, go right ahead. Open forum.
Okay, sharing screen. Okay, share screen.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple comments on your, as far as the Anglo world hearing about Ukraine. I think there's certainly been Herculean efforts in the last 3 years to improve on that, but it's always a challenge. I mean, and even for the president. I mean, Zelensky going on Lex Friedman, I think, was very good. Uh, although I have many criticisms of the way Lex Friedman talks about Ukraine, as I imagine you do as well. But even 2 days ago, he was on Piers Morgan, which was fantastic. A response from to Tucker Carlson's insane comments, which he usually makes, which he made last week, just blaming Ukraine on everything that's happening to them by Russia. And the translation that was done, unfortunately, was so bad. I mean, it was just so bad. It was I'm sure he's a nice guy that was doing it. Like he sounded like a very young guy, but his English, getting that Zelensky, I understand very well from his history, can empathize very much with both Russians and Ukrainians. The way that he's, obviously native born Russian speaker, but the getting his enthusiasm, his drive, his support for the people through a translation is difficult, and I think it's very hard for people to understand that
Okay,
sometimes.
this is why I wanted to share the screen. For example, this guy, Denis Davidov,
Yeah,
he's actually a pilot, so in big airlines, so he speaks pretty good English. He runs his channel. He updates the news from Ukraine. Sometimes he can be a little bit overzealous, but like I said, it's easier for me to say because I didn't have missiles drop on my back in my backyard. But
yeah,
this is an example. Like I don't think anybody ever interviewed him, and yet he's got a lot of news about Ukraine. He obviously speaks Ukrainian and Russian and English. He does not need an interpreter. Like let's say this guy Alexei Arestovich. He's Russian. He's Ukrainian commentator.
yeah,
Uh, called pro-Russian in many ways because sometimes he raises very unpleasant subjects, in his commentary, and sometimes people kind of go like, "Hey, you kind of, you have to kind of pick a side." But he's now in US. I think he gave a interview to one of the American channels as well. So, I don't know if I can find it here, but no, can't. Oh, this guy,
Patrick Bet David. Yeah,
yeah,
actually, I missed that one that he did with him. I have to look at that.
yeah. So he did the
Yeah,
interview with Patrick, and Patrick really tried to catch him out and say, "Hey, because this guy is apparently persecuted in Ukraine for some things he said. I'm not going to comment on that, because I think some of my friends might get upset if I do that. But the way he's like getting his in time in with people like Patrick, which is usually represent the side of like, hey, let's drop Ukraine, let's drop everything and just like give Russia whatever they want. And then somebody like this comes in on Patrick's show and he was very polite, but the way he dismantled most of the Patrick's arguments was actually quite interesting to watch. And again, they've translated the stuff he was saying, but as far as I know, he also speaks English,
Mm,
so people can actually get him. But he was in this interview. He said, "Look, I want to speak Ukrainian because it's easier for me. It's like because I come here to be able to express my." But they also did a very good job translating what he was saying. So I
yeah.
give credit where it's due. Even though Patrick is like being like, how about this and how about that? It's like, and these guys was like very clear in his message, right? There's a guy. This guy, he talks about mostly about history. Shanka show. This guy lives in U.S. I don't know if he's gonna go for such an interview, like, but he does have a lot of interesting views about history. He was born in Ukraine, moved to U.S., speaks perfectly good English. And again, people generally, I don't know if people ask him about his opinions because within his channel he doesn't talk about things like this. He usually likes to make fun of USSR or explain certain some of the subjects which were happening in USSR. Like interesting channel. The guy's from Ukraine. Lives in US, speaks good English. Um, there's a Polish. There's an entire program. Again, these guys maybe getting them more into like American media world because these guys are from Poland, as far as I remember. They are they're making their programs in English a lot most of the time. But obviously they know the situation. They are much closer to the situation. They journalists obviously speak the languages, you know. So Ukraine news. I don't remember is this one in English, but I think it is one of them that is in English. So again, getting in touch with these channels and getting some of their journalists on programs. Like I think, 'cause if it's not journalists exactly, there will be like interpreters who are like pretty good in English, but they at least they can give the view from the point of view like of hey, we're in Ukraine, this is what's happening. You know,
Yeah.
this guy, he says, I'm not sure whether he's from Latvia or in Lithuania. He mentioned it, but in some of his videos, like, but again, he speaks the Russian language. He's nearby. He can talk to people. It's like I'm not taking credit from people who have actually like this American journalists and American YouTubers who actually travel to Ukraine and spend their time with Ukrainian troops. I'm not taking credit from them because they do a very good job. And like as any normal human being, I'd say, hey guys, thank you very much. You're doing a great job, like amazing. But these people who actually do speak the language, who understand the culture, their voices are not actually being heard.
Yeah. It seems
So
like that in the Anglo world, unfortunately. Artur, last name seems to me to be Estonian. Doesn't seem to be Latvian or Lithuanian. But I
I'm
haven't.
not going to guarantee you. That's why I'm saying like he mentioned it, and like I
Yeah.
again, I'm not a professional YouTuber. This is not something I kind of live on by. Like also have to do
Sure.
other things to make
Same.
money and things like
Not a
this. So
professional YouTuber either.
all right. But the Russian dude, the guy is actually Russian. He makes videos in English, right? I don't think
Yeah.
anybody ever, and he's not like he's on the side of Ukraine, so it's like, and he's very upbeat in many like the way he presents his material, like. But again, I don't think many people have heard of him outside the people who actually like go, oh, Russian, like I know Russian, I'm gonna listen to,
Yeah.
you know, right? Uh, this is again, this is a Russian guy. He makes videos from like he's moved out of Russia, but he makes videos about Russia.
He's in Uzbekistan, I believe.
Yes, I think so as well. Yeah, but
Yeah. He's in Tashkent. Yeah.
but he is actually does some very deep analytics, like
He's
like
great. He's
yeah,
one of my favorites.
and again, like why he's not on the channels, why is he not interviewed? Because his English is pretty good.
Yeah.
Like I mean, I lived in England for nearly 20 years, so I've got an excuse. This guy is actually, I don't think he ever lived in England or US, but his English is very good, and
Yeah.
people can bring him on. Also, if you know about this guy, Michael Naki, right? He's also a Russian guy. He does a lot of videos, but he does have an American passport, so he's obviously got to speak English.
Mm-hmm.
You can't get American passport without speaking English. But again, he does a lot of videos.
There's a lot of people would
And
argue with you about that one. But we'll leave that aside for now.
yeah, but again, like, but he doesn't only does videos. Also, like very much like this gentleman here. This Michael Naki doesn't only make videos. He makes a lot of videos, like 2, 3 videos a day on the news of what's happening in Ukraine. So, but he also has few people. Some people come to him and do analytics. So he has like some guys from Russia who come over, and they would run him the economical analytics. I don't remember if I can find the video. Oh yeah, this guy
Milov is
for
good too,
example.
yeah.
Yeah,
Vladimir Milov, yeah.
yeah. I don't
He's
watch
good.
much of his channel, but obviously he mostly does his stuff in Russian. So I'm not gonna say about how good he is in English.
He was a deputy. Yeah, true. It's all in
Yeah,
Russian. It's for the Russian audience, but he was a deputy energy minister, I believe, under Putin in like the first 1 or 2 years, which is 25 years
yeah,
ago. For people
yeah,
that think that Putin's a democratically elected president and Zelensky is a dictator per Tucker Carlson. So
yeah. Okay. Uh, but again, something like in some of my videos, I was saying that look, there's a lot of okay, but yeah, we can probably, but yeah, but this is at least some people like I just quickly picked them out. Like I said, look, this is some places where people can start and the people can talk to these guys who do this and they live this, and these people do not get as much time. And obviously, like yeah, a lot of them, many of them do their videos in English. Some don't, but
yeah,
you go like, okay, guys, it's like there is such a big reach. Like if someone like Joe Rogan or somebody like even that Patrick or some other channels, they claim, oh look, we are independent media, like we're not like that other media, so we want to bring you like real stuff, real things. Is like, okay, so you want to bring us every point of view. You claim that you're not like the normal media. Why don't I hear any voices from Ukraine on Joe Rogan's show? He brings in Russian dudes,
yeah. It's
except that he
complete.
doesn't.
It's complete audience capture. He knows that most of his guests, rightly or wrongly, they want the U.S. to at least continue to take this sort of purposeful retreat from the world. Whether anybody wants to say that's right or wrong, that's the view, and it has to do with a lot. The problem is it has to do with a lot of other factors, right? It has to do with, COVID mandates, or it has to do with government spending, or it has to do with DEI, or trans
I
women playing men's trans men playing women's sports. It has to do with all these things, and somehow Ukraine, since Biden was the president when they were invaded, it became this sort of Democratic Party champion issue, and they're just rejecting that. That's my view on the main reasons. But it's you're totally right. It's absolute audience capture. The only person with a real large following that I think is in that same orbit to me that I have seen is actually Pierce Morgan. Pierce Morgan's not afraid to. I used to think Pierce Morgan was just some, fool that was doing American Idol or whatever. I didn't really follow him much, but his show now is pretty popular. He's doing it himself, and it's pretty strong. And he is not afraid to cut both ways. I think he's had a very good mix of opinions on Israel Palestine and on Ukraine. And the fact that Tucker can just be so blatantly biased and victim blaming and all the rest, and Pierce Morgan will not do that, shows that he has some backbone and character to who he's catering for, and even his advertising audience. It's like there's a much wider variety of viewpoints, in my opinion, on someone like Pierce Morgan, which I respect. But Tucker, for sure, no. I mean, it's Kool-Aid, turtles all the way down. Even if there are plenty of things that I agree with certain segments of that population, certainly not all of them. But, this is a very, unfortunately, and I feel this way for sure. I'll let you, respond here. But I was watching a World War One. I should put a link in the show notes. It was a World War causes for World War One, and there was a lot of conferences that were happening around the 100-year anniversary of World War One, which is the same time that Crimea was taken. This is 2014, same time as Maidan and all the rest. And one of the American diplomats who was originally involved in expanding NATO to beyond the borders of Eastern Germany, which again there was never any promise made to Gorbachev, nor did Gorbachev speak for the free parliaments of any country after the Soviet Union dissolved. This diplomat was saying, look, and this is something that obviously hits home very much to me. This is 2014 that he's talking, and it's post Crimea invasion, so Europe is finally waking up to what we've always known, and you guys have always known, that they were going to be irredentist and aggressive and try to take back territory. But he's posing a question to the audience about the reasons of World War One, the nonsense of World War One, and he's asking, look, if we want to talk about sovereign borders and protecting it, who here in America is going to go over and fight if Putin goes into Latvia, for example, and tries to protect his minority Russian-speaking population? And of course, his is a very loose term. It's not his at all. Putin thinks he can claim any Russian speaker all over the world. These are Latvian citizens. They're not, Russian citizens, all the rest. But it's the same reasons why, the Nazis started World War II, and there were plenty of irredentist reasons as well of World War I. But the question just remains, who here is going to go and fight for these the sovereign territory of Latvia? And his opinion was even European nations in 2014 wouldn't be prepared to do it, even though NATO has the Article 5 treaty. And I can say the wild twist of fate in 10 years, Yuriy, is that now, because of what Ukraine has suffered through, I feel at least we have clarity from Sweden, Finland, which, by the way, just joined NATO. They weren't in it before. They joined it because of Putin, not, any other reason. They joined it purely because of him. But the Baltics are at least more protected now from Poland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, and the UK. The UK has always been steadfast as far as, getting behind some European unity against Russian aggression. But those are the only countries. Denmark as well. But France, Germany, Spain, forget about it. Portugal, forget about it. Nobody's going to come and still to this day fight for us if something happens in the Baltics. And then for you guys in Ukraine, you've been suffering now for 10 years, and we still see delays. We see, misinformation. Zelensky talks about how $30 billion of military aid hasn't reached Ukraine, he's not saying that that was stolen by Ukrainians. He's saying it just hasn't been delivered. It hasn't reached Ukraine. And the vast majority of aid that came from the US, the dollar, when people talk about dollar values, it's in old military kit that's shrink wrapped in US warehouses, and Americans aren't going to use that kit anyway. So it's all a massive amount. It's unbelievable. 3 years of Ukrainians getting glide bombed and droned every night. We still have this disinformation from Putin, as Zelensky said, ass lickers like Tucker Carlson. So anyway, I just want to go on that little tirade because the misinformation is still here, and there's still not clarity in the European community on defending against Russian aggression and defending sovereign borders. First and foremost among the Ukrainians. So anyway, I'll stop there.
The thing is you touch on so many subjects. It's like you essentially kind of let's lay out the plan for the program, right? For the next 2 hours.
Open forum, whatever you want.
No, but like, I mean, the first one you touched on, for example, the promise to the Gorbachev, promise to the Soviet Union, and everybody says, "Oh, but we promised to the Russia that we will not gonna expand." And okay, let's take this break away from this argument, right? Because this is always a very big base. Ah, but NATO
It's a
promised
favorite.
to the Russia. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Am I allowed to swear?
Whatever you need, man.
This is bullshit. No, seriously, like obviously most of the Westerners don't really kind of know the history of the fall of the USSR.
They have no idea. They think it was
They
only about the
don't.
Berlin Wall.
Yeah, it's about where they stop. Yes. Number one, the promise to the Gorbachev was never about not expanding NATO. They said they will not build any new American bases past Berlin, right? Which they never did. And not only that, they actually removed some of the bases from Berlin, from around Berlin, because I live in Berlin, and you kind of go, and there's like some places which are completely like going derelict. These used to be American bases, so all that has been removed. So that's one thing. But let's remember that the Gorbachev was a president of USSR. Right? And very people forget that in the end of 1989, beginning of 1990, I think, the Russia has declared its independence from USSR. It was the first republic to officially become independent from USSR. Right? It's like the Russians keep on claiming that Latvians, Estonians, and so and Lithuanians are the big traitors who betrayed USSR and left USSR, whereas the truth of the matter is that Russia was like pretty much the first one who left USSR, and one of the reasons like generally kind of remember that is because we did have a very good history teacher when we were going through that period in school, and one thing he pointed out is was the only time in history, it was about like it was a few months, like by a year, where there was an independent Russia, a country, which has its capital in Moscow. And then there was a Soviet Union, which is a completely different country, which had its capital in Moscow. So essentially, the when people talk about the fall of Soviet Union, like when the Russians go like, "Oh, it was the NATO who made us drop the Soviet, who was destroying Soviet Union." It's like, no, it's not the truth. The truth of the matter is that it was the Russians who have left USSR, and for like only a year later, most of other republics they just had to admit, like, look, without Russia taking part in USSR is not working because we do not have the connections with many connections between many republics. They were going through Russia, right? And once the Russia left, like there's no point for USSR in a way because it is there's no way of keeping it together. So many republics were like, they left and they were like, okay, cool. This is why SMG was created. this kind of new version of USSR, literally because they were like, hey, we still need those connections. We still have like the production lines and things like this. We still have like food supply chains. Like we still need to maintain them. So this is why they have tried to create this structure of these independent nations, the Союз независимых государств, so the Union of Independent Nations, right? To at least maintain some sort of sanity while the countries were finding their way. You know, so when people say like we promise something, it's like no, it's not the truth.
Yeah,
Like
that's a
and
good point. Actually, I know what you're referring to. I looked it up just to be clear. We got on June 12th, 1990, the Congress of People's Deputies adopted the Declaration of State Sovereignty, established separation of powers, unlike Soviet form of government, established citizenship of Russia, and stated that the RSFSR shall retain the right of free secession from the USSR.
yeah,
And on yeah, so yeah, I know that idea. So that's a very good point actually for Russia itself wanting to break away from the Soviet Union. Uh, though the Baltics were still before that. We were in like the spring of 1990. We declared our independence, and then the violence
all right,
started. The violence started in January of 1991 when they tried to bring
yeah,
us back. So it's still been murky with the Soviet government in Moscow and Gorbachev, as peaceful as he might have tried to be, he still went violent on us. But yeah, these are things that nobody in the West has any idea about, and they act like it's all the same. And of course, Ukraine. This is the other thing I want to get your thoughts on. This is everybody keeps talking about Crimea in 2014, and Donbass and everything else. Everybody ignores the referendum that the Ukrainians had, which is still the only referendum that's nationwide today that would be uh, internationally recognized, where every single region of Ukraine, by a supermajority, it's true that Crimea maybe only by 60%, but everybody else was like 90%, including Donbass, 90%, 95% voted for breakaway independence from the Soviet Union. And that's still the only referendum today that holds. So anybody that would want to show about, Crimea voted, they did that at gunpoint. Yeah, it's possible. I don't know that if they had a
no,
referendum. No,
no, they
okay.
didn't.
Enlighten us, please.
There was a little bit of like there's again that referendum was a bit of a tricky one as well. So essentially, Ukrainians were given a choice. They said, look, do you want to try and maintain the old Soviet Union, or do you want to go independent and then see if we can build something new? So this was one of the ideas where this SNG came from. Like, so Ukrainians went like, look, the old one is not working. It's broken. The whole system was broken. So yeah, we want to try. We want to get out and see what if we can build something new. Whether it's going to be Soviet Union, whether it's going to be something else. And the fact of life was that even though Ukrainians were like, okay, cool, let's try building something new. Like even the Russians were not interested. In the first years, the
Sure.
Russians were like not interested. The only things they were interested in is like, oh, can we get on some, hold of some of your factories and then pull them apart and sell them for metal? That's about as far as we go. So nobody was interested in building Soviet Union. And look, I generally say you can call me a communist, you know, and I generally say, look, there's a lot of things we can learn from Soviet Union, good or bad. But I'm not on the side of people who just like seem to be two sides of the argument as well. Like it's either Soviet Union is all good, it's all brilliant, and there was nothing to repair, And then there's another argument: Soviet Union was all horrible, all like disgusting, and it should have been destroyed by a nuclear bomb. Now, I'm generally somewhere like one of the few people who says like, look, this Soviet Union was not perfect place, but if you can name me at least one perfect place, please, I'll be happy to admit that it's like, if it's perfect, I'll be the first in line to say can I move there. But
Yeah.
no place is perfect, and it's like usually again this is very big argument still happening in people's minds because I generally say, look, the USSR I remember and the USSR like we went through is like it's the end of the 80s, it's the 80s, like I was born in 82, so it's like it's that part I remember. It's that part that was happening on. So it's like I'm not gonna talk about for how USSR was in 19 like 30. Like I will say, look, these are the bad things they've done. These are some good things they've done, but I'm not gonna talk for the USSR of that time. I'm just gonna look at the history and gonna say, okay, this was good, this was bad. I want the good. I want to get rid of the bad, but I have not lived through those times. Hell, I have not lived through the 70s, So like for people to say everything was horrible is wrong. So it's like same as now you see probably like you from that area as well. So you sometimes see from people going like, oh, like you like even some Ukrainians go like, oh, Ukraine is all bad now. So we just want we go out, we're happy. And it's like, or some people would say, oh, how dare you say that? Ukraine is all good. It's like all like flowers and roses and unicorns running around. It's like, well, okay, how about we keep it chilled? Like this like everybody has got their problems. It's not perfect. So, but like I say, the full time of the USSR, it's like that part is just so much to do with that. Come on, it's like something that should take really like. I mean, the channel I shared with you, the Oshanka show, right? He made hours and hours and hours of videos talking about all the issues in society, things like this. So it's
Yeah.
like it's a very difficult subject to go through. But the leaving of the USSR, yes, it was all legal. And when Russians say that Russians and people who maintain that we should give Russia everything it wants, when they say we have to do this because we have not followed on that promise which was given to USSR, like go like, well, yeah, but I'm sorry, guys, Russia was never USSR. Russia was one of the first ones to jump to bail the ship. So can we stop claiming that we owe them anything on behalf of something that they themselves broke down and didn't make any effort to fix?
Yeah. And the timeline there is the one thing that's quoted all the time is the not 1 inch from James Baker. And that happened in February of 1990. February of 1990. So there's still 2 years to go for the end of the USSR. And you already mentioned the citizenship of Russia starting in June of 1990.
Yeah,
Again, the Baltics were already on their way out, but still, uh, there was no, there was still during, and anyway, it wasn't a treaty. I've talked to libertarian lawyer Stefan Kinsella about this, who's about the only libertarian in the United States that somehow respects international law. I think, most Americans that really want to go hardcore are like very irredentist. They're very much saying, okay, well, if you feel like this is a territory that you somehow deserve, go for it. But anyway, besides that, there were no treaties. There's no treaty. There's not this is how big boys like they know that if there's a treaty, then it means something. And there were no treaties signed. It was in the minutes, and it was specifically about, like you said, the bases in East Germany at the time. It wasn't even a concept to talk about the Warsaw Pact countries or anything like that. But yeah, you just have to repeat that again and again and again. No matter how many times you say it, people like Tucker Carlson will just vomit up the same nonsense.
the point
But
is nobody's saying nobody like it's not about repeating. It's about like I feel that I'm probably the first person to say it out loud on any English speaking channel whatsoever.
that the Russian state themselves had already moved on from the Soviet Union. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a good point. That's a good point.
yeah,
June 12th, 1990. Already there
yeah,
were Russian citizenship laws passed. It's true.
yeah. So it's
It's
like,
true.
and you talk about, and you listen to people, and it's like this is it's like but okay, I understand that we're like everyday people, so not all of us supposed to know the history. But the politicians that
Yeah.
claim they were part of that history, not saying that, not like pulling that back. This is where you go like, okay, wait a minute, guys, like Barack Obama lived through those years. He
Yeah.
was there. He wasn't like, he was in Ukraine telling Ukrainians, hey, give up all your weapons. We're not talking just nuclear weapons. He was, I think, one of the top in the commission that actually drove for Ukraine's disarmament,
Yep.
right? Telling Ukraine, hey guys, like remove all your tanks, remove all your planes, like, destroy all your artillery and everything else, like all your ammunitions. And if you get in trouble, we're gonna help you. That was Obama was there, like, and him not to call Russians out on their BS, for
Yep.
him not to say to Ukrainians, oh, the Russians took part of your land in 2014. So bad. Okay, well, we're gonna send you a few blankets.
Yep. It's like the
It's
Germans
like,
wanting to send helmets in 2022.
yeah, it was like, okay, well, it's like, wait a minute, things are a little bit weird there. Like, you were the one who was telling to Ukrainians to destroy their munitions. And then when Ukrainians said, hey, sorry, we have a big problem, like, on our, like, all across, like, majority of our borders, there's, like, a big problem called Russia. And Obama was like, oh, sorry, guys, don't really know about this, How about we send you, like, some little things? And
Yeah.
Ukrainians taken, like, this is why I was very, like, on the side of Trump when he started sending weapons to Ukraine.
Yeah. They were locked up. They had to be locked up, unfortunately, those stingers, but at least you had them. Uh, Originally, they
No,
had to be locked. Originally,
they
in his first term, they had to sit like locked up, the anti tank stingers. Uh,
no, Ukrainians you trained them, and when Russians came in, those
of course, they used them.
anti-tank missiles, they were like,
Yeah, yeah, and the
you know,
Balts gave them as well. I'm just saying, in the first, like before the full scale, when Trump was president from 2016 to 2020, that was the original requirement. So they had to be locked up in some lockers, and they just had to sit there. Like, okay, you have them, but don't use them because there was only the frozen conflict in the
yeah.
Donbass at that time. But the
Well,
sorry, just one more point about that. Obama, people forget that Obama, it was when he was maybe even a junior senator. He was over in the Donbass looking at, you know, Ukraine's arsenal. Maybe I guess it wasn't the nuclear arsenal, that was already beyond that, but just more weapons, old Soviet weapons being destroyed, being moved away, just being removed from Ukraine's self-defense capabilities. So the U.S. is responsible for that. And another thing that it's funny to me that if you're a conservative or if you're on the right, and a lot of Bitcoiners are on the right, a lot of people that want personal freedom and sovereignty are on the right. I'm not saying all of them, but some of them are. And it's amazing to me that they're not supportive of Ukraine because the worst disasters in Ukraine's sort of short independent history from 1991 happened under democratic administrations. I mean, the first one, of course, was the Budapest Memorandum, happened under Clinton. That was a terrible document. I mean, it was absolutely true that there was this security assurances given, but as an American, as someone who's supposed to stand by their treaties, everybody says this was not a treaty; it was just a memo and all that stuff. And Putin makes his excuse. And look, I think it is terrible that they didn't stand behind it for sure, fully. But I would also concede, as an American, that this is just terrible, wishy-washy language. And Ukraine, as Zelensky said in his Piers Morgan interview, gave up their nukes for nothing. For nothing. That's the net of that agreement is everybody's just going to ignore that agreement, even though it's way stronger than like meeting minutes, which again have nothing to do with NATO expansion. That's the whole red herring. But it is true that agreement was wishy-washy, and Americans should be ashamed of signing such a document like that. So that happened under Clinton. Then we have Maidan revolution. wonderful revolution of dignity, throwing out Yanukovych for the second time. And who was president during that time? Obama. Well, Obama, what did you do about Crimea getting taken? Nothing. And then we have the full scale. Who was president during that time? Biden. After his disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal, what did he do there? The net of it is still nothing. After 3 years, we have nothing. And so if you are someone who believes in sovereignty and independence and, I don't know, traditional, strong military conservative values, it's amazing to me that they actually are trying to go the other way now, a complete inversion, because you have the evidence that the Democratic side, who might talk a big game about freedom and liberty, they have done nothing that has really helped Ukraine. Okay, we can talk about all the weapons and that. I know that stuff, but Zelensky made the case again. It was drip fed to them, and it was not even delivered in full when Biden finished all the promises. So again, I've always been of the opinion we could have kicked them out. It's not about going to war with Russia. It's about kicking Russia out of Ukraine, just like the United States and the coalition did it in Kuwait in the early 90s, in the same time as the Soviet Union fell. You could have done that in 2 weeks. But everybody was scared. Everybody thought that Russia was actually more competent than they were. And now here we are 3 years later and still succumbing to Putin's threats. Anyway, I keep going off on these tangents.
Oh, we can. It's fine because again, I was for the last few years. I mean, we're not talking just through the war with Ukraine. I was kind of critical of a lot of Western governments. I, I hope they're not going to ban you for this, but my opinion
Don't say
about
the word. Don't say the word if it's a bannable word. I don't know.
I don't know, it's like I'm not sure if it's bannable or anything, but okay, I'm gonna rephrase it a little bit. But on my channel, I was a bit ruder to them, but they've instead. I'm generally saying that the most of the Western politicians should have long gone retired. Instead, they have gone senile. So
100%. Geriatric central. Absolutely.
yeah,
100%.
so
It's a
so
terrible
yeah, so
system. I mean, the UK can go through like 6 prime ministers in a month, which is fine to me. Let them try and be young and spriteful. But I mean, you have to be a geriatric senior citizen in America. It's a very damaged system at the moment. Very damaged.
well, it's funable you spoke about Biden, but when Biden got elected, I've made a video with predictions, and I said we're in a funny era where the American president is gonna run out of sand sometime mid-speech, and then we'll see him completely disintegrating in the middle of the stage and just turning into a pile of rubble. And in the same video, I predicted economic collapse after the COVID and Russia attacking Ukraine. So and Biden proved me wrong on proved me right on everything.
Hmm.
And I was like, come on, guys, if I can see that the guy who's not it's not my main job to kind of see those things. If I can see those things coming from a mile away, right? It's like I mean, I understand you chose an old guy, right? But you should have somebody that capable of doing this. But the problem I see with the Western politics is I actually compared it as sometimes with the Soviet politics, the end of Soviet Union era politics,
Hmm.
where you had guys who essentially came up in Soviet Union. Though by the time Soviet Union was falling apart, there was about over 20 years where the guys were coming up, more than 20 years from probably about times of death of Stalin. So we're looking about 30 plus years, where the only people who came up through they were the ones who did not actually resolve anything. They didn't do anything. They were people who entered the first Komsomol, that they would go into the Communist Party, and they essentially go up through the party line, and they were completely separated from the main society. And it was also only the people who completely who screwed up so badly that they could not be ignored, that would get punished. But most of the people, most of their actions were unpunishable. Like they would not suffer the consequences. And we see the same thing in the West,
Yep.
and not just in politics, but in economics as well. So the way to go through up and become a prime minister in England is, you know, let's just say providing services of a very particular kind to the people up or higher ups than you in the party. And it's not about actually doing anything. So it's like, so you get a lot of like 60, 70-year olds who have never really achieved anything. They've never really done anything, except being very, very serviceable for the people, for the higher ups, essentially being like a yes man or a woman, and then they would end up like going like, okay, cool, now we've got this, and they were living in this kind of very weird world of this mixture of greatness of USSR, which is now Russia, which we already established that it was not, but also in this kind of like pink pony world where we have beaten USSR, we can just chill and do nothing. It's like this is why they come up with things, and you go like, guys, have you ever walked the streets of like London, or have you ever been to like the back alleys of Paris, or like I'm not even gonna go like stuff we hear from New York and was it California and Los Angeles, I think, where people like, sleep on the streets. It's like you get an impression that like, wait a minute, like we're living in the two different worlds, like and very same stuff is happening in Russia. So their politicians there again, very old people, majority of them, and like if we go look at the reasons why Russia was attacking Ukraine, it's like why it is a Putin's war, right? And if you look at this, it's like because Ukrainians have dared, like this is why the Russian government was so much aggressive towards the Balkan states. It's like, hey guys, I think you know Latvia, Estonia, Slovenia saying that, oh wait, you dare to pick new politicians? You don't dare to keep the same ones in power? Like, if you look at the wars that Russia has been in since, well, since the end of the 90s, they were all Putin's wars, right? And you see the Western politicians living in their like wonderful little world, completely ignoring everything he does. And he lives in a wonderful little world where he can do anything he wants, because these are like two people who seem to be like, I don't know which drugs they're taking, but on some really heavy stuff, which are essentially not in touch with reality. I mean, and this is why, like for me, like looking at the West, I think my prediction would be that the Trump is the last of his generation. So I think we will see some very big changes in the West soon. But
Trump
until they
still
have,
is cut from a very different cloth, though. It's hard to know where these next 4 years will go because, and I'm curious your thoughts on it. I think Ukrainians very much could welcome a positive change because Biden, as we've talked about, was just drip feeding any aid, being a politician, not being strong, not going in and just finishing it in 2 weeks like he could have, like Bush Sr. did in Kuwait. But we also know that Trump is very transactional. We know that he's acting like a dictator. Whether he will go violent on his threats, he's still acting like a dictator. And what he wants to do in Panama and Greenland and Canada and Gaza now, which is pretty wild, the statements that he makes. And a lot of people don't take them seriously. They say, look at his actions, not his words. This is a very different situation than even under Biden. So I do worry about that. I think everybody knows that he doesn't. I don't think he has any empathy for Ukraine at all. I think the war is just a pain in the ass for him. He'd rather go back to making some deals with Putin, Xi, whatever. And I think he wouldn't care at all if the Baltics, for example, were invaded. Um, I'm not even sure he cares about Taiwan. I think he would just want to do a deal with Xi anyway. He's very transactional. In certain things, being transactional and being pro business, of course, is going to be great for business in the U.S. And he wants to do America first. But we're just in a very unfortunate wave for Ukraine and for Eastern Europe, which is actually always what Eastern Europe has had to deal with in the last 150 years, is when Western societies go national, go very nationalistic, and go very much inside themselves, so to speak. Uh, the vacuum of power, unfortunately, is right here in these bloodlands, as Timothy Snyder calls it, in Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, the Baltics. And of course, all of us, luckily, are in NATO at the moment, except for Belarus and Ukraine. But I don't know. How do you feel that a post deal? Well, maybe we should even get to the deal first. Like, do you think there is a deal that Ukrainians would accept? And I don't necessarily think that there is. I think that we could still be at war a year from now. But do you think there is a deal to be done with this frozen conflict idea in the
I
east,
think
eastern territories?
there's a very heartfelt song by a friend of mine, uh, Diana Mass, and she's now lives in London. She's been living there since for quite a while now, but is originally Ukrainian. And she has had this very wonderful song. She's like when the Russians only invaded, like the first invasion in 2014, and she was like, "Russians, go home," right? So, and the deal the Ukrainians would accept is that, like, look, just pack yourself up, go home, build your country, have kids, be the normal human beings, and we'll be
Yeah.
happy for you. Just pack your stuff and off you go, right? Stop coming to trying to fix us when your roads
So
are falling
simple.
apart in the rain.
The solution is so simple.
Yeah, but speaking about Trump, like yes, Trump would like to make deals, and I think, but also I like we already said before, the Trump is already given Ukraine weapons. And remember, all the limitations on the use of weapons were not introduced by Trump. They were introduced by US Parliament.
Yeah.
Trump
No.
was
No.
going like, hey guys,
No argument. No
here's
argument.
the weapons, use them as you need them. And he was actually stopped. And people forget why he gave them to Ukraine. He already made the deal with Putin. Like in his first term, the reason he gave Ukraine the weapons was because he made a deal with Putin for a ceasefire, not even like stop the whole war. He said, look, let's do a ceasefire for a few weeks so that we can sit down and make the actual deal, see what works for you, see what works for Ukrainians. And Putin signed the ceasefire deal, right? They shook each other's hands. They say, okay, they give a command in Ukraine and in Russia, right? They say, okay, we having a ceasefire. And before the Trump gets to his plane and before his plane leaves the ground, the Russian artillery starts shooting. So it's a matter of like a couple of hours difference.
Yeah.
Here we signed
This is.
upon
I
deal.
shouldn't laugh at that. I shouldn't laugh at that. That is. That's what a lot of people in the West do not understand either. Is
Yeah,
Lech
it's like,
Walesa, the old Polish president, he said Russians have one hand on the pen, the other on a hand grenade, and that's always
yeah,
true. That it's them that kept this violating the ceasefire under the Trump
and it was like,
administration.
and the Trump, like, and I actually made some comments. I put them on another screen, but like I can share them. But I was describing exactly this story in one of the comments a few months ago on Quora or something like this. Yeah, Quora thing. And I was describing exactly that. That Trump does not trust Putin. He's happy to make a deal, but I think a lot of stuff, it's like, okay, I'm happy to make a deal, but God save me if you don't hold it. And but we already understand that Putin lives in his own land of ping ponies, where everybody's gonna let him do whatever he wants. So he's gonna sign any deal and he's gonna break it within hours. And that's the thing is in the sense, as soon as this happens, that's when the Trump has an excuse to go all in. This is where he's say gonna have a full excuse. He's gonna say, "Hey guys, look, I tried. I'm not gonna send the soldiers, but here's the weapons."
Yeah, it's possible. I've definitely heard the theory. It's if try to get them to the table. If Zelensky, which he has been very much willing to come to the table, Putin has not, of course, because Putin thinks that he's better than Zelensky and his name is Vladimir, not Volodymyr, and all this stuff. And he thinks that he's going to be the one, like a great power, to deal with Trump. And then the there's carrots on both sides, but the stick for Putin is, yes, if you refuse this deal, it's just all out, full scale U.S. support for Ukraine. And I think that is a legitimate. I mean, that's a legitimately real possibility.
Yeah, but
I'm not
I
sure the
think
probability, though. I'm not sure the probability of that, considering the way that Trump himself is, his
it's
transactional
very it's
nature,
a
his.
very high it's a very high probability because like remember when Trump was becoming the president for the first time and everybody was saying, "Hey, he's gonna flog Ukraine to Russia in like the first 5 minutes of presidency.
Hmm,
He's just gonna tell Russians, look, you can go in, blow stuff up, we're not gonna care."
yeah,
That did not happen. Like, can we kind of at least like stop listening to people who are saying stuff and then like, look, you have been wrong 100% of the
yeah.
times. I'm probably gonna go with my with what I see in front of me rather than hoping that one time in a billion you're gonna be right. You know?
I completely agree. I mean, that's the point I was making about the Biden administration and the Obama administration. Like, if you are for conservative, free, liberal Western values, it's not a you know Republicans used to stand up for that in the world, and you are have all your political uh, the political clout in the world to continue to do so because the Democrats were so weak and so terrible when the going got tough. And I completely understand that point, and I'm absolutely not discounting that it could happen. I think it's the most hopeful thing to think about the way that the trajectory could go for Ukraine. But let me ask you this: how does Putin react then? Because uh, Putin turning his tail between his legs and going back, if Trump really does go full on support for Ukraine in the next 6 months, either the threat or the actual reality of sending more weapons at some point. What do you think Putin does? I mean, the obvious first response is the nuclear escalation. What do you think his response is going to be?
His response is number one, he does live in the world, like say in a very weird world in his head. But nevertheless, he knows this world very well. So my original, when I was saying, because I have some, for example, Russian friends in Berlin, when I was saying to them, like in 2021, I was saying, look, the war is inevitable. They're gonna send the troops into Ukraine, and then they will try to conquer it, but the whole point of this war is like the main point of this war, which many people not paying attention to. It's internal. It's not external. It's not to actually capture Ukraine. And this is why, like, and he needs an excuse to say,
Sure.
look, we did, but there's like a certain, he needs an excuse to say to his people where it's like, hey guys, like, do you really want a nuclear war? You know, there is a time when we have to like unite because the world is against us. You have to follow the leader, like, because you see we're trying, but like, if we're gonna continue, like, and that was the thing, the original intent of the war. The original intent of the first incursion was like they were, but then they got lucky because they had a very big breakthrough in the south of Ukraine. Right? If they were repelled there, this war would have been much shorter. But because they had the success of coming through Crimea, and again, this was through
Yeah.
some local, betrayals from the local, old
Well,
guard.
that should be pointed out. By the way, I mean that's a huge thing in Ukraine. By the way, I mean there were treasonous. There were what's the word? There were triggers that were set up in the prior 8 years for a southern invasion through Crimea that did not hold in February 2022. Like the reason that the south of Ukraine, the southeast fell was from some betrayals, some Russian sympathizers. I mean, there's some treason. As far as I know, there's still there's an outstanding, that's going to be a part of the post-war investigation, is the treason that happened down there in the south and the east. Is that true?
Yeah, well, my ex-fiance's mother is being searched for by Ukrainian intelligence service as one of the people who
Okay, so you have
was
a closer connection than I
like,
realized.
yeah, yeah, it's like, but no, it's not the 8 years. It was like many people, like if you look at Ukraine, right? For example, when Russians were going towards Mykolaiv, right? Very different reactions by the people who run Mykolaiv than the people who run my home city, Kherson. This is where I'm from, so it's like, why? Because in Mykolaiv, during the prior election to those local elections in 2019, there was a lot of they elected a lot of younger people to come in into power. As a matter of fact, I think Ukraine at the moment is probably one of the youngest ruling people in power through most of the the same
Mm,
Western world.
mm,
So it's like because Ukrainians were electing more younger leaders and they were electing more people from local businessmen, for example. The guy who's running Mykolaiv, he's actually a local businessman and people knew him as a good businessman, so they elected him. If you look at my home city, Kherson, then there's a lot of people, or the people that were elected there, they were still the old guard. So we're talking people who managed to get into business, often not through the most legal ways, but they are dating back all the way to USSR. So the mayor of Ukraine, he was like again in his 60s, close to 70s, and a lot
so
of
these are the very
people.
much negative aspects of the USSR that you mentioned.
Yeah, it's like these are the people who were still again. Many of them they were like, "Oh, we're gonna join Russia. We're gonna become part of the USSR." And USSR was so brilliant. And some of the people, so for example, I know that there's a you probably know a little bit more Ukraine. Have you heard about Privat Group?
Which group? I'm sorry.
Privat Group.
No.
It was Kolomoisky, if you heard about this name.
Yeah. 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 Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so
Right. Right.
that's his structure, so semi-criminal structure. For a very long time, they were also pro-Russian,
Yeah.
and it's only in 2005 because they were pushing for after the first Ukrainian revolution in 2004. The Kolomoisky group, there was Russia was trying to create this single economic space, right, with Russia, and the Kolomoisky group was actually pushing for that. But from in 2005, they completely changed direction. So they've turned around and they went and decided to go towards Europe.
Was that only a change in leadership? What was the reason for that change in direction?
Me. No, it's a
Do
funny
tell.
story.
Do
My
tell.
uncle used to be part of that group. So he was not a higher up management, but in my home city, if you read the book Who's Who, his name would be in that book. So he was on the official side of the business. And basically, we had a conversation with him. I'm sure it's not just me. So it's but I think I was the one who pushed my uncle, obviously. We had a conversation in 2005. And I was talking about differences between Europe and Russia. And one of the things I said to him, I literally like I was quite blunt to him, and said, "Look, you're getting old. You know, the time he was getting into his like 50s, I guess." And I
Yeah.
said, "Look, you're getting old. Anything happens, and you need to get to that very expensive because he's got money, he's wrote that." I say, you need to get to that expensive clinic over there because this is the only place in the world that does this particular procedure or can save you. Like, you need to be as part of Europe. You going that way because in Russia and Ukraine, many of the procedures which are available in the West, you need to have access to that.
Yeah.
And we're also discussing the differences in business. And I was saying, look, you can look at Moscow, but if you look outside of Moscow, the business is still like this. Somebody in power likes what you're doing. They come over and they say, hey, we're going to take that. Here's a little bit of money just to keep your pants on for the next few months, and then you're out.
Yeah. Let me interrupt you just again for the Votniks and Gopniks and Tankies out there that really love, Mother Russia like Tucker Carlson. This is not a new phenomenon. I mean, through the 90s, through the 2000s, until today, any Western company that went into Russia got fucked. Absolutely. I mean, there was no like you could call it like a nice way, like a consulting fee, like IKEA had to do. They had like a bribe line item on their books. IKEA had a bribe line item, but it was consulting. Or you can have basically your enterprise taken from you, which eventually fully materialized in 2022. Like the Carlsberg guys, they lost everything. Like it was full on confiscation. Dannon, full on confiscation. Others, like I'm blanking on, full on confiscation. But of course, there's a huge gradient in between that. So from the 90s, where you would either have a line item for the corruption, or you knew that you were eventually going to lose the business after taking your little cream of starting your hard work and getting it done. You're eventually just going to lose it to an oligarch. That was the name of the game for Russia. It's not a secret. It's just not said enough. People in the West, people that are
They
in the
don't get that.
Anglo Western Europe, well, they do not get it at all. Like it's just a very different place. And the Baltics, look, we were former Soviet. We had plenty of, and we still to this day have like these local oligarchs, little mini oligarchs that still try to get around and do their business with Russia and China or whatever. But it's so different. The benefits of being in the European Union, the benefits of being in NATO. I mean, it's a night and day difference that was, I mean, dare I say, forced upon us, which was good. We wanted it generally, but also there was reciprocation. I mean, the young people wanted it. Like
Yeah.
everything that they would see in the West was bright and light, and everything they would look in Russia was just darkness and cynicism. And we're gonna take your lunch money anyway. So Ukraine has been trying to get out of this for 30 years, and people just still don't get it, Yuri. They do not get it.
They don't. Like they have like Ukrainian got lucky because, well, again, I did one more thing which kind of really pushed Ukraine forward. And that was not an intentional something. It was just a spur of a moment thing. But I got introduced in 2005. It was like my first trip back to Ukraine because I left Ukraine in 2000 and I couldn't come back because I did not have a travel document. And I moved out, I wasn't 18 yet. So I was written into my mother's passport. And
Mm.
obviously, once I got 19, I couldn't get the travel document. So I did not go back to for Ukraine for a few years. It was the first time I came back to Ukraine. I got introduced to the guy, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was a second person in charge of the Commission on Tourism in the Parliament of Ukraine. It was just right before the Eurovision in Ukraine. And the witness to this was Alexander Vityukov, who's my cousin's husband. He was the one who introduced us. So he was there when this happened. And basically, I persuaded that gentleman that Ukraine needs to remove visas for like pretty much anybody from any country most of the developed countries and half of undeveloped ones. So I said, look, remove all the tourist visas. And we were talking about tourism because he was obviously in charge of tourism. And the way he was listening to me is like, well, you live in the West, how does it work there? Because we have our people, looking at this and obviously, but they never lived there. And you guys just came from there. So, and I was saying, look, you need to remove all the visas. And he, but the argument of the analytics in Ukraine, this is like where you see the kind of old way of thinking is they said the visas are bringing Ukraine like $7 million a year. And I don't think the Ukrainian parliament ever heard anybody laughing so hard as I did in that moment. Like, and the guys were like, nobody ever talks to. This guy is a parliamentarian. He's like part of this big, like semi-criminal syndicate. He was from the Nets group, right? And now
Yeah.
you're laughing in his face, and you're like 22 years old, like kids, like laughing in this guy's face, like, are you insane? Like, like they were sitting there, like, oh my God, we're gonna get murdered. But I literally laughed at us. I'm not. I was obviously quite straightforward. It's like I'm not laughing at you, but we sat down and we did the numbers. And I said, look, many Europeans they travel for like a weekend, right? You probably met that. So it's like you have a long weekend and you go like, where would I like to go? And nobody's gonna pay for a visa to go for a long weekend. Like so, so they were limited in number because they were coming up with all sorts of different tourist programs. So before I went for this meeting, I got given all the magazines and like some of the stuff which was happening there. It's like again, it was quite funny, but I was like, I obviously made fun of those because I was like, look, it's not even the magazines, it's the presentation and the ideas in them. But I was saying, look, many Europeans they travel for a weekend, right? They don't want to go get a visa. When they come in for Eurovision, they don't want to spend 3 weeks in Ukrainian going through Ukrainian embassies, which were not the best working embassies on the planet. So it's like they don't need all that. They just want to go, buy a ticket, get on the bus, get on the plane, and come over to Ukraine. And so they did that. So they pushed through. And it's funny that when the Ukrainian president was reading the reasons why they took all that law, because the law got taken so in less than 2 weeks, essentially. And we were writing down all the bullet points why they need to take the law, and the bullet points just moved on from that room where we were sitting with this guy, writing down those bullet points, and they went through the parliament, from him to the Commission on Tourism, through the Parliament, and into the law and into the presidential speech. So even the order in which he was saying those bullet points, like it was President Yushchenko, it was in beginning of 2005. He was reading those, and the order he was, I was like, well, we kind of talked through those bullet points. And again, this is like where I'm usually like when I say tell this story. This is where my antisocial, like not very good with human people, like nature came out because to this day I'm thinking, why didn't I change numbers with that guy? All I had to do is just change numbers with this politician who really listened to me. Like he was like many of them are very very smart, but because they live within that system, like
Yeah. Yeah.
the world of pink ponies. Like I'm not saying that many politicians are way smarter than me, like, but they live in this world where there's like it's separated. And then he got like some different view, and you could hear the way he was listening. He was not just kind of blanking out, but he was actually like, okay, cool. He was doing the calculations in his head, and when we were doing the math, that they were like losing like $10 million a weekend simply on tourists coming to Ukraine. It was like, look, this is a weekend. You saying 7 million? Like, this is what you could be making in one weekend. you know,
Yeah.
Imagine the taxes you get on that. Imagine all the cash that's coming. But this decision really played a like very good role because Ukrainians, if you remember, they received, for example, a European basketball championship. They
Yep.
have games happening in Ukraine. They have EuroLeague, I believe, the football championship, like happening in cities in
I was
Ukraine
at
and
that
Poland.
in 2011. I went to a
Yeah,
game
yeah,
in Kiev.
yeah. And the reason they've received all those is because they have had, the Europeans went, yeah, we don't have to do this. Like it's easy for us to travel there. The connections are there. So, and this was like, and this has changed a lot the youngsters as well because now all of a sudden the youngsters were introduced to the Europeans. All of a sudden they didn't see Europeans as something out there like this. They didn't have the perfect Quran picture or like good or bad. All of a sudden they saw like, oh look, there's British hooligans. All they do is just drink beer and scream at each other,
Yeah, the stereotypes are rich in Europe. A lot of Americans don't understand that too.
Yeah, and it's like, and they say, oh, this British hooligans, they're kind of cool. They like beer and peanuts, like we like beer and peanuts, Oh, they like to
Yeah,
have a little fight. Okay, we gonna fight them. We don't mind. I'm obviously this is a little bit of a play, but like that has started changing Ukraine a lot. Right? This is why a lot of more new era politicians are became viable in Ukraine. Like if you look at Germany, for example, again, I live in Germany now, and sometimes you look at them. Again, Trump's favorites ADF. And if you've ever tried opening up the image gallery of ADF, like they claim that they're AFD, sorry, AFD,
AFD. Yeah,
Alternative für Deutschland.
yeah,
If you look at them, it's like it's the same, like you said, it's a geriatric club. It's
yeah.
like they have a couple of young faces, but everybody else is in their like 60s. What kind of alternative they gonna provide?
Yeah, it's a bit irredentist as well, and it's surprising because, um, again, Germany has to deal with this Nazi past and whether they can overcome it and their war guilt and everything else, and so AfD is trying to take the view that we want a Germany without guilt and all the rest, and in some stance, of course, that's completely understandable. But then when you have a nation that is literally suffering from the exact same types of irredentist invasions that Germany did to Poland and Czechoslovakia and Ukraine during World War II and the Baltics. Uh, it's amazing that they are still so pro-Russian. Like in the Baltics, we're so immune to it. Like Russian propaganda is like water off the duck's back. I think we're the only countries, and perhaps Ukraine now has joined us, and Poland, that has 100% resistant to Russian propaganda and Russian disinfo. But in Germany, it's running rampant, and it's amazing to me that it's running. And perhaps you can enlighten on this. From Germany, it's running rampant in East Germany, where they should know how shitty the Russian past is, like how dark and cynical and empty it is. Why would it be the East Germans that are saying, yeah, let's go back Russian style, get some cheap Russian gas, and let them take over Ukraine?
I'll tell you why. And it's kind of simple because uh, we're actually chatting to a friend of mine who's from Russia, and we visited a German spa. If you ever seen anybody cross-eyed after sauna, that was a wonderful experience. But we were coming back and we were sitting on the train and we started talking about this. And something like, he was like, look, they're horrible. And I said, yeah, but they're the only people who talk about the problems the Germans have. All the rest of the parties, they, like I say, they live in the world of the pink ponies. They think
Sure.
you get an impression that they think everything is wonderful. It's like, and so that you understood how bad things often are in Germany and why many Germans are pissed off, like the Ukrainians that moved to Germany during the war. They were like, we thought we were coming to the first world country. Like Ukraine is miles ahead. the Ukrainian like government structures, the Ukrainian service
Mm.
kind of government service is like leaps ahead of Germany.
Yeah, that's incredible. And
Like,
they must feel so left behind by their Western counterparts.
and
It's sad.
it's not and it's not just that. It's like, but the Germans say, hey, we have problems. Like, I just an example, like an anecdote, I think it's correctly understand, where I worked with a German guy, like, he's about 24, 25, he's married, he's got a kid, lives in Berlin, lived here his whole life, and he's been trying to find a place to move because they've got a kid, and it took him 2 years to find anywhere to move. Because first they give into the flats to one set of refugees, then they were giving flats to someone else. And it's like, and then he was like, look, I'm all for helping Ukrainians, but it's like, why is it that I'm coming in? I lived in here all my life, and people are telling me, no, 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 you can't have this flat because we booked it in case some Ukrainian refugee is coming over and needs a flat.
Yeah.
And that attitude, and he says, I have like, I have my own life problems. Like, you're not solving them. And like, I came to Germany legally, so I'm facing same issues he does. And obviously, you can see the Germans going like, "Hey, wait a minute! You like throwing good money after bad onto these things, but you're not actually resolving the issues." And I'm like going like, I've met this in England as well, and quite often the question is like, okay, there's over quarter of a million of empty apartments around Germany, like at the moment, right?
Nationwide.
Yeah, nationwide, right? They've been left empty, like some of them even like half abandoned. Like, why are you settling Ukrainian refugees in Berlin if there is a town which is essentially half empty, just about? I don't remember the name, but it's kind of going towards east.
Mm.
It's a half empty town which suffering from the lack of population. It was like where you could take people, you could settle them in those flats, and that would relieve some stress from Berlin. Now, why is it that people living here in camps on an airfield, like little metal houses, when you have towns which are half empty, the flats are left like pretty much abandoned there? What's going on? Like, and then these people are trying to they're living in those camps. They're trying to find places to live, essentially competing with the guy from Berlin whose only fault is that he's German, right? We have this all sorts of problems like this, obviously, but this is just as an example. And the thing is like people like IFD, people like Nigel Farage, these guys, and Farage is from England. It's like
Yep.
was it Marie Le Pen? Was it in France?
Yep. Le Pen.
Yeah. And they pick on immigrants because immigrants are easy to pick on, right? They don't pick on the big corporations that abuse the situations many immigrants are in, because that would be like, oh shit, I have to tell the truth. Like, one of the major reasons for Brexit was the fact that nobody would talk about the big corporation taking advantage of like bringing people from the poorer parts of Europe to work in England for peanuts. It's like
Meanwhile,
nobody.
immigration increased after Brexit.
Yeah, now they're bringing people from all everywhere else. Like, nobody's speaking in US about the fact that the many farmers in the South, or the big corporations. We're not talking the small farmers. We're talking big corporate farmers are quite often employing the immigrants. We're not just talking about half the price of American labor. We're talking employing them illegally.
Oh yeah, no, people talk
Just
about that for sure. but
not not
I know what you
not
mean. I mean, it's
not on a main political spectrum. Nobody's calling them out. So this is why it becomes easy for people to poke fingers. Ah, these immigrants, they came in and took these jobs.
sure.
Because they're poking at immigrants, they're not poking at the rich guys who give them money to talk against immigrants. And when people talk about main media being like not writing this, not writing that, it's like how can they support like? And the question I generally ask for, who owns the main media? It is the big corporations, like so like let's put the blame where it should be, and then the guys like IFD is like let's talk about the problems, let's present the problems in the correct light. I mean, again, personal experience of illegal versus legal immigrants. When I was one of the reasons I could not leave England because I came there like not yet 18 on my mother's passport. So we knew there is you can get an ID to travel around at least around Europe. When we went to apply for this ID because I was already living in England, I went there with my mother's husband. I knew they're gonna say no. All right, so I came there like we can try. If they say yes, it's gonna be brilliant. But we because I'm here legally, I was like, okay, they're probably gonna say no because I didn't come here as an illegal immigrant. And this is exactly what's happened. It was a point blank question. Did you come here legally? Yes. Then we can't give you the travel pass. You should have seen the reaction of my mother's husband. Like the guy nearly blew up. It's like he was like, what the hell? Like, we do everything right and they screw you.
Mm,
Whereas the somebody who came here illegally gets all his rights and gets all his
yep.
benefits.
100%.
And
That's
nobody's talking about this. Like
well, I mean, this is the other issue, one of those issues that I mean, where I think is very much correct for this new right or however you want to say. There's plenty of the spectrum of the right characters, whether you're hard right, far right, new right, whatever, that are bringing up immigration, at least in the U.S. And I think in Europe it's starting more, but where it's correct to realize that look, the policies are undermining. They're either undermining the local population that is trying to work and the legal immigrants that want to come in, or it just has to do with all of your other macro policies, which have already outsourced all of the, you know, better machinery manufacturing that could have helped us. You've already outsourced all that to cheaper countries anyway. So all those things, big macro issues, I agree with you. They need to be addressed more. But unfortunately, again, I go back to our discussion on Ukraine, is that we have a situation where they're stacking all of those things up into the category of we need to bring it back home to focus on the local individual and not focus on immigrants or helping, foreign aid or helping Ukraine. Obviously, we say USAID AID or USAID dismantled by Musk last weekend. So all of those things are a very huge headwind for Ukraine because you're fighting against that. Whereas if it was 1991, of course the climate would have been completely different, but you wouldn't have a maniac, tyrannical, irredentist leader in the Kremlin, which you have now, and that's what you're fighting against. So it's Herculean what the Ukrainians have to go up against because of all these issues. And I don't know. That's where I'm wondering about your family or friends back home, people that you talk to that are, what's their impression of sort of the attitude that Westerners are giving them? Because in my opinion, it's been very lackluster. It's been very much, for me, it's very clear. It's very clear because of my Baltic history, but it's also very clear because anybody that knows their United States history would know that the French helped the United States defeat the British at Yorktown with a majority of help in every category. More artillery, more ships, more soldiers that lost their lives, more casualties. We could not have won it without the French. And this is a convenient fact that is looked over by all the nativist, sometimes racist Americans that think that they can just do everything themselves and they magically did everything themselves. History is a lot more complicated than that. So it's not hard at all for me to say we need to 100% support a free and liberal democratic Ukraine, 110%, and we need to continue doing that. But obviously, people get tired. It's been 3 years, and people are tired. They don't want to talk about it. They want to go native. They want to go, local, no foreigners, no immigrants. So, what are Ukrainians? What is your opinion of that? Do Ukrainians feel that? Do they feel that the West is not showing them as much support as they like or would need?
From what I hear from Ukraine, as I say, they've been feeling that from the very beginning. They've been feeling that from 2014. It's like that. There's
100%
this
from
kind of,
2014. There you go,
you know,
Obama. I mean, you have Democrat in the White House. You're going to get someone who doesn't know anything about foreign policy.
yeah, despite having traveled all over Europe, yeah. You go like,
Yeah,
come on, man, you've been there, like. But no, the overall feeling was like, look, we made a deal. We stuck to our end of the deal. We did our best. I mean, the Ukrainians, yes, I was not there, but they have started changes even during this war. That's what something
the full
President
scale.
Zelensky was pointing out. He said, look, even during this war, we took the laws to fight the corruption. As a matter of fact, the two generals that were in charge of the defense of Kharkiv before the second attempt on Kharkiv just this year, they are actually being investigated, and I believe they've been being court-martialed for some of the stuff they've done. It's like this is unprecedented in like
Yeah,
last God knows how many years. The generals screw up, and instead of like giving them fancy retirement, people say, "Hey, wait a minute, like
yeah,
you have done wrong." It's like these are the changes you see in Ukraine. So it's like people feel that the West is like kind of not acting at all. Like we give you something like I've made this video, the gentleman we talked about earlier, the military commentary, Ryan Macbeth also said
yep,
done the video, I think probably just a few weeks after me when we were both talking about the fact that the Western support does the weapons the West gives to Ukraine, right? It's like the different the choices are one, you have to dismantle those weapons because they're not the newest systems. You cannot keep them forever, so you have to pay for dismantling those weapons, or you give them to Ukraine. So when somebody says, "Oh, we gave Ukraine like 30 billion worth of weapons," it's like,
yeah,
well, actually, you saved yourself 30 billion on dismantling those weapons because
100%.
making those weapons safe often costs as much as building them new, right? So nobody's talking about this, but they throw these big numbers, and even those things they claim to give, they like provide them. It's like, okay, here's a little spoon, here's a little like there's a little drip, like, and then what they say as well is like, well, we're gonna give it to you, but you cannot really shoot it towards Russia,
Yep. Can't use it.
right? Right, you can't like you have to kind of angle it so like give it a good angle. So it would be nice if it wasn't flying like if the Russians attack, it would be nice if it was coming from the kind of east. So it's like if it was flying towards Ukrainian territory, and I was like, how do you expect us to do this? Like go into the Russian territory, drive in there with your like nice like your expensive missiles, and then shoot them at the Russians' backs? It's like it's it's
Yeah, it's
not
just,
even
you just defend yourself responsibly.
yeah.
You're getting invaded. Your people they're trying to exterminate you, but defend yourself responsibly. You know, you can't defend yourself. That's basically the view. And again, my line, which I will just repeat to anybody forever until this war ends, is there is nothing more to our American friends. Is there's nothing more American than getting help from a friendly partner to fight your independence. I mean, fight for your independence. There's just nothing more American. And
I
all
mean,
these trolls, all these Bitcoiners who are not supportive and say, "Oh, fight your own war." You know, you're going to start World War III. You're terrible. It's all your fault. Blame the victim. You wore too short of a skirt before you got raped. You whore. You know, you guys just are just terrible. All these little trolls, these little hard asses who sit in their mom's basement, they have no idea that the Americans would not have won at the Battle of Yorktown without the French. They have no clue of this. They're just
but to be honest, like, I mean, those guys, they're a minority, but, and I'll give them what they, I'm saying, like, look, guys, then can we concentrate on the people who are in power? Because, like, how the
good point.
Western help looks like? I'm gonna make a very kind of interesting, like, imagine that, like, a woman, you have a town, right? And in this town, they said, okay, all women must give up their weapons because for whichever reason, right? Or all people who live in this town must give up their weapons. It's only like the trained sheriffs that are supposed to carry them. So people say, okay, cool. The sheriffs are there to help us. They're the police. So the woman gets attacked. She's being beaten and raped. And then you have this really old sheriff who can hardly lift his gun. He comes up to this woman while she's being raped by a bully and a criminal, and he says to the woman, "You know what? Here's a pillow. You can use it to make yourself more comfortable." That's
Precisely.
how that's how a lot of stuff which comes from the West is like, here's some weapons, just make yourself more comfortable. I mean, if you can look at the screen, I'm just sharing an article.
Yep.
If you can, like,
1 second. There we go.
okay, cool. This is an article from One Shot, One Kill. There's a guy that tried shells at Russian vehicles. Let me just check. Oh, yes, cool. Updated 5th of April 2022. So this is the beginning of war. The whole principle of the article, the reason I found it is we talked to, like I say, a journalist. I will call him a journalist, friend of mine, and saying, like, I said, hey, look, this, I had this thought, like, why don't people put, because there's been an uprising from Ukrainian military saying that, well, quite often the reason we can't stop Russians invading, like, going into certain villages, we can stop them in the field, but the drones, they don't carry big enough payload to destroy houses. And what the Russians do is they lose, like, they send in like 300 people, they lose 200 people, but then they put 100 people into the, like, couple of houses, and that's how they kind of end up taking over this, but like a particular village or something like this. And the artillery, because obviously artillery has to stay like a few miles, quite a few miles behind, they still use normal shells, right? So because of the distance, by the time they land the shots that can actually destroy the buildings, Russians already moved on into different buildings. Right? And now I was like, why don't we use, like, because there is a laser gated guided ammunitions. I was like, hey, can we put the lasers onto the drones that Ukrainians using, and then use those drones, like FPV drones, to shine the laser that those shells can actually go through, like, and they can hit those buildings. It would make brilliant sense. And as we were talking to this, I was like, hey, do you think it might be a good idea? Like, so, uh, I was like, you could probably pass it on to the head of your department, so to say. And then I was like looking, I was like, oh, wait a minute, Ukrainians are already doing this. They were doing this in 22. So imagine if you, why do we have this, still have the problems of having to shoot five, six shells? Why do we still have it in 2025? Like, there are old shells, in, I'm pretty sure, in many of the Western militaries who still use this technology. They just like because you have to replace those shells every like so many years. It's not that they can stay there forever because the explosives and stuff like this it becomes very volatile. You essentially at some point of time you can't actually use them anymore, right? So you have those. There are those things there. Like why is the technology not being used very often? Why is it not being supplied? This something like this could solve a lot of problems. As a matter of fact, that it could probably like having a very precise fire would probably stop a lot of attacks, and it probably well, like, I don't think they would save a lot of Russian soldiers, but it's like, but it would save a lot more
This
lives.
is this is war, and you're trying to kick them out of your country.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah. Go ahead.
but let's look at something else. Let's look up at the planes because everybody talks about providing Ukraine with F-16s.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to look Embraer Super Tucano. Right, this plane, this is Embraer, but it's a turboprop plane. It can carry like most, not most, but quite a few modern missiles and bombs, which would be required mostly weapons that would be helpful in, for example, knocking down drones and like Russian missiles, because it carries Signed-Wider missiles. And I'm using this one as an example, but I do know for a fact that US has got over 100 planes because there's an American plane which is essentially a copy of this plane. It has been used by American forces during the war in Iraq and Afghanistan for special for supporting special ops. They have over 100 of them sitting in a hangar in the hangars in one of the air bases in the US.
Yeah.
Right, so it took years to provide Ukraine with F-16s, right? Until people finally went like, yeah, we kind of have to give them. If Ukraine received 50 of those planes at the start of the war, right? These planes are not fast enough to become a huge attacking force and stuff like this, but they are much cheaper to fly than F-16s. They can land essentially in the field because it's a much simpler turboprop, so it's much easier to maintain. Could be there's plenty of Ukrainian mechanics that could do that because they're not as fast and they're much easier to fly than like full on modern like F-16 like they can go above sound barrier and things like this. You have to have very particular requirements to a pilot. Ukraine could have plenty of pilots to fly those to knock down drones and Russian missile barrages. If Ukraine had 50 of those planes, at least from 2023, thousands of lives could have been saved, and we're not talking just soldiers. We're talking women, children, like obviously men who stayed, like teenagers, everybody.
Yeah.
Like those missiles, they don't pick their targets. The reason the Russians don't pick their targets is because they want to have Ukrainian air defenses as much spread as possible. Because they know if the Ukrainians have the opportunity to bring their anti-air defenses, the missiles that Ukrainians have, they will be not able to knock out Russian planes out of the sky. But Ukraine is now forced to spread out their air defense very thinly across the entire country because they don't know where the next missile is coming.
And as it's been terribly tragic. I mean, it's been, it feels like it's nearly weekly that there's another just pretty major. I mean, like where a dozen or, just innocent civilians are killed. But even in spite of all this, and in spite of all the failures that you just mentioned, the fact that Russia doesn't have air superiority, the supposedly second strongest military in the world. I mean, these losers, like they are so. It's so. What's the adjective? I mean, it's embarrassing. It's uh, it's tragic. They this is a nation that thinks that they're on some imperial, irredentist, sovereign crusade, primordial crusade. This is like some backwards nation trying to do this, and they're claiming that they're like some strong empire. They are getting, you know, they are getting beaten by Ukrainian drone operators. Ukraine has been super creative as best as they can with, one arm, two arms tied behind their back. And Russia just cannot get air superiority. It's incredible. And that going back to what we said about what Trump could do if he needs to play the maximalist Trump card, so to speak, if Putin rejects the offers for a freeze. I don't know why there's not more Americans for sure, but even Europeans. I mean, the Germans, of course, are always the backlog there, and the Hungarians that aren't saying we need to max out the support now to prevent all the deaths. And yeah, here we are. Here we are, 2025, on the eve of 3 full years, and they're still not trying to allow Ukraine to have air superiority when clearly the Russians cannot get it. It's embarrassing for them. They are just a drunk, terrible. I mean, I'm sure people have seen it. I don't know if people on this channel. I'm hoping I'm getting some Bitcoiners watching here that don't think about this stuff very much. But there are videos of these Russian conscripts going in for their second or third meat wave on crutches. I mean, these people are the most unprepared, ill-defined army one could have ever seen. It's an absolute embarrassment for them. But because of their maniac, genocidal dictator, they continue to throw meat wave after meat wave to an underfunded, Ukraine that's trying to defend against this. But it's so embarrassing for Russia, and the fact that the U.S. and Europe can't stand up and say max support now, 3 years on, is it's very disheartening for me. And I do hope you're right that the max out support for Ukraine option comes from Trump, whether as a threat or as reality, because I don't know what else Ukraine could do at this point to show they're not backing down. Their people are real sovereign and 1,000-year-old people, no matter what anybody wants to say of it, least of all Vladimir Putin. And they're completely united against rejecting this threat. I don't know what else they could do, frankly. So I don't know. I mean, I have friends in Ukraine. They tell me that they're exhausted. They tell me that everybody's tired. Uh, is there any hope that you see there from the people in leadership or the people that are, the young? I know there's this whole battle now with Ukraine trying to the leaders trying to still stave off young people getting mobilized into the army, but is it just really tired? What's the general opinion on that?
There is, like, people are tired, but there's one phrase I said and some time ago, and I was saying that there's a very like the reason the President Zelensky won the election is because at that time he really clicked with people. Why he really got the people's support. And
78% or whatever it was.
yeah, it was a big number. One of the reasons is, again, something nobody in the West says, is one of the major reasons he got that support is because he was saying, hey, I'm going to do everything in my power to get behind the table with Putin and see how we can sort that mess out. Like, I want a peaceful resolution so that we can actually move on with our lives. That was one of his major selling points, and he was like, doing everything in his power ever since he got into power to try and stop the conflict. But it was always been the Putin's conflict. So the people are tired, but I think there's a lot of stuff which are happening in Ukraine which are very positive. Like there are positive changes that are coming through, but they're not talked about enough. So people don't hear those positive messages. Sometimes certain things they take much longer to achieve, like or to happen. And a lot of times I was saying there's a problem that the Ukrainian government still has though, is despite that there are a lot of good positive changes. There's a system which is still in place in Ukraine, which dates back to Soviet Union. And many people within that system, again, they have started in Soviet Union. So they'll be like in their 50s, 60s. So they were starting in that system during, and these are the people who survived in that system through the 90s, through the beginning of 2000s. So there's a lot of like mid-level corruption is is not like, and it's not like specifically corruption, just people not doing what they're supposed to do, for example, or like stuff like this happening, and people see that on these places, and there's not enough messages that saying, hey, we're doing these good things, like and the problem Ukraine has is if they have actually declared that, look, we are having an all-out war, they might have had an excuse to clean the system because there's like a very good pressure from the bottom to change things.
Mm.
There are people at the top that are trying to change things, and then there's people in the middle, like a big chunk of people in the middle who don't want to see change for them. As much as they say, hey, we want to have a better country or something like this, just so long as I don't have to change, so long as I don't have to do things a new way. And this is where the government is losing out, and they're losing the connection with people because of that middle ground. So to give you an example, we already talked about the generals finally somebody like, yeah, they're holding it with somebody which was higher up responsible. They said, look, you said you can do the job, you got the job and you failed. And why is it that you failed? Let's take a look at that. There were positive changes happening in Ukraine. Like I said, this was the major reason for Putin to invade, was because Ukraine was getting better and better and better despite all the bad mouthing from the Kremlin. It's like, but the problem of the government is they're stuck in the bog of that middle system. So we talk about military for quite a while. They will say there was things coming through from the so military themselves. They were saying stop creating new regiments. We have old experienced regiments which need more people. We can do the job. If you're creating new regiments with soldiers that have never been in the battle, they go there, they get slaughtered because there's nobody to pull them back and say, hey, slow down. Hey, this is how it's done. Because it's one thing if you do it on the training field, and another thing if you do it in the battlefield. Like, anybody who's done any sort of martial arts, you go to the training session and you're like, yeah, I'm doing so well. And then you go even into a sparring match, and all of a sudden you forgot everything you do. So this is the same situation was happening. So, but then the experienced part, the experienced soldiers were not getting the support they needed. Were not getting new people, so they were getting killed more often, like because of that. Now, after that situation which happened in France, for example, where like it was like 1,000 soldiers completely disappeared somewhere in France
Yeah,
while
do you have any
training,
insight on that?
again they had officers which were like they were trained. They didn't really, many people, like they don't exactly want to go to war, There was also that they were getting, for example, French training, but they were still getting those Soviet officers, you know. And they went like,
Yeah.
I believe that many people were like, wait a minute, like again, this is not something, but I can assume that is that many soldiers were like, wait a minute, we're getting this training, but we've got this guy who's going to try and lead us into the battle, and he's going to do exactly the same stuff that the Russian officers do. He's just going to throw us into the field without any proper support. We don't want that. We're out. Like,
Which is not true.
quite often it's actually the it happened. Even in Ukraine, it happened. So
From
where there were
Western trained
yes, because
soldiers.
the soldiers are Western trained, but number one, Western training is nowhere near close to what needs to be to what's happening in Ukraine.
Mm.
So like many Ukrainian soldiers, they were like, yeah, we get trained in the West. So like they would say to them like, example like I think it was Aristovich was giving that example as well. So it was like the Western training is like this: you come across a minefield, you walk around it. You come to a minefield in Ukraine. It starts near Kherson, it ends near Donetsk. Start walking. You know, so a lot of Western
Yeah.
militaries they don't really like they do good training on the equipment they're using and stuff like this. But when you start getting into tactics and strategies of how to use things, all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a minute, like the stuff you're telling us is not the stuff we're hearing from the actual frontline because many Ukrainians have the somebody who they know who's already either been to the frontline or is there. It's like so they come in, it's like, and then you get a bunch of officers because I believe the generals from that division that had this problem with people. They were the old guys. They were like in their like 60s as well. So and a lot of stuff they brought with them was still kind of a Soviet era thinking. And now you have the soldiers who go like, if I go to serve under this general who has never really been in battle, but the stuff he's giving me, it's like it's not like if you go to a company for a job and the managers are horrible, you can quit. It's if you go with this guy into battle, you're gonna die.
Yeah.
And these things have happened in because in Ukraine they did become. It's not like in Russia where they say, "Oh no, our soldiers don't die." It's like and the Russians still don't believe that when somebody tells them, "Oh, guys, over 1 million of your soldiers have either died or received injuries that are not really compatible with healthy living."
Maybe you want to share a little thoughts about why they're so gullible to their propaganda and don't believe the reality on the ground.
They still live in the 90s. Well, actually, I've made a video saying why is it over 70% of the Russians support the war in Ukraine? Did it a couple of years ago, but the reason is they live in their little bubble, right? The mentality there, like we already discussed with you earlier, in many places in Russia, the mentality they still never left the 90s. Like
Yeah.
the local like the crime bosses, they wear like nice suits now and probably drive a bit nicer cars, but they're still crime bosses. Some of them actually serve in police. The local there's also the fact that like many regions in Russia, right, they are very poor. Like I was just a couple of days ago, actually watched a video by a British guy with a Russian wife. They go to this town and this city where she's from, somewhere like in Siberia, I guess. It's like, and they were told saying how the city is like having new buildings built and everything else. And
Mm.
it's like very interesting because I was like, okay, cool. I was like, okay, I'm gonna give it credit. I'm gonna listen to them. So I listened to them, and then somewhere like by the end of the video, I'm not sure if I can find it, but they say like, but to be honest, this city is growing. But if we are gonna be completely honest, every city and town around it have lost at least 50% of population.
Because of mobilization.
No, because of poverty, bad living conditions, low
Mm.
wages. People simply either living or dying.
Yeah. Let's remind
So
our viewers as well that 25% of all Russia today doesn't even have plumbing. This light on this beacon on a
the
hill
coun-
that people think Tucker Carlson
the
thinks is a great place that is just liberty and full of wonderful things for their people.
the country that was supplying gas to all of Europe, and was it like 50% of that country does not actually have gas
Yeah.
pipes in their
I
towns
mean,
and
it's the funny thing
cities?
is Americans, the appeasers, the appeasniks, the votniks, the tankies, the gorpniks that want to, sit there in the West and act like Putin is somehow a good guy. They denigrate some of these comments that the U.S. sort of establishment politicians have said about Russia for years, which is that it is a gas station described. Uh, it's a gas station that's sort of camouflaged as a
Attached to
country,
Europe.
right? It's not a real, and people are like, no, Putin, he's a strong leader. He's really trying this and that. He's standing up to the West. I mean, these views are just they're so blatantly wrong. They're so blatantly tired. I just don't know how blind someone has to be, and how many Ukrainian children uh, have to die or be deported for this to end. But it continues on. It's unbelievable. It continues on.
A, a true story, because many people in the West, they don't get it, but a true story. That's the difference between Ukraine and Russia. It's like about the same time, there was scandals in Ukraine and Russia about school toilets. And in Ukraine, the scandal was that in the school toilet, they obviously in Ukraine, all the school toilets are inside the school. Right? So it's disappointed this story. And the whole mess was that whoever was doing the repair works in in the girls' toilet, right? They basically did not fix the doors up properly, so there was a hole, and
In
people
Russia
could
or
actually
Ukraine?
in Ukraine.
Okay.
So there was a hole, and people could just kind of pop in and look into that hole and see what the girl was actually doing there. It became like the whole country was like up in
Scandal.
arms of all the
Scandal.
it was like
Yeah.
yeah. In Russia, the scandal was that they couldn't even put they basically they did not. There's a big school, right, in the northern region of Russia as well, and they basically made the outside toilet. So they didn't put toilets inside the school. They just dug a hole in the ground, and the scandal was that they made it out of like wood and not a proper structure.
No beton. Yeah. No concrete.
No concrete yet. So in that they had to kind of build a little concrete houses in that. But it was like that's the difference. Like in Ukraine, people were going up in arms because somebody made it like just bad design of the things they were making, just but bad workmanship. Like in Russia they would, and in Ukraine was like, how can you do that? In
Right.
Russia, people were, well, okay, cool. Kids can go into the bushes. Who cares? Like, yeah,
Yep. It really
it's
is
like,
oil
and
and
it
water,
happened.
night and day,
It happened
sun
about
and
the
moon.
same time. So it's like, and I was like, come on, like it's like it's two different worlds. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and at that time, Ukraine was a much poorer country than Russia.
Mm.
Like, if you look at because many Russians were like, one of the things I say for since 2004, a lot of Russian propaganda was like because the first revolution, the first Maidan in Ukraine was in 2004,
Mm-hmm.
and a
Orange
lot,
Revolution.
and then the prime minister of Ukraine, she was not again a very how to put it honest lady, and she tried to get into the gas trade, so she started that gas war with Russia, and I was like. But the fact was, since that
Timoshenko, you're
time,
talking about.
yeah, Tymoshenko,
Timoshenko.
yeah, yeah, and she started. She was the one who started the war with Russia, like no questions asked. But from that time on, the Russian propaganda was like, look, you can try not to elect Putin, but then you will have what's happening in Ukraine. If you don't vote this kind of single Russia party, then you're going to have what's happening in Ukraine. And the difference between Russia and Ukraine was that time, this is when the gas and oil prices started shooting up.
Yeah.
So the people were getting a bit more money. The whole idea was that Russians are making more money than Ukrainians. But if you trace through, like, because people still talk, it's like, even though you have an argument, but until the Russians invaded in 2022, people still talk to each other. Like, I still have family in Russia, like very distant cousins and stuff like this, but nevertheless. And yes, I didn't keep in touch with them, but other people did. There were Russians who came to live in Ukraine. There were Ukrainians who went to live in Russia. You know, and what started happening is the Russians started getting more info from Ukraine because many people still speak Russian in Ukraine. So the Russians could get access to like Ukrainian information, and the people will started asking questions. And then 2014 has happened, and Ukrainians stood up to Yanukovych, right? And like and then the Russians invaded Crimea. The Russian invaded the eastern Ukraine, and they were saying, "Hi, you see now what Ukrainians did, and now they have the war inside Ukraine." It's like, we're not saying there's Russian soldiers there, but if you don't support Putin and his party, you're gonna have what's happening in Ukraine. So there was a lot of propaganda going on to the Russians and
Yeah.
telling them like, "Hey guys, it's like." Then they were telling them that, look, these guys who come into power in Ukraine, they hate all the Russian speakers. They hate us. It's like, and the push was always like, they're living like crap. They're kissing the ass to the West, but they are not actually, but they're not succeeding. Look at us. And then in 2022, like, it's like it was already obvious that if you look, for example, at information like official minimum wage in Russia and Ukraine, if you look at that, it was actually high. Minimum wage officially was higher in Ukraine by like $2 or something like this. So the Ukrainians have started doing better. The thing has started. The things have. Oh, are you there? Sorry. So you disappeared.
I'm
Yeah,
there.
but
Just
the
got a
things
big
have
cold.
started. Uh,
Trying to not
Winter
distract from it.
time.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, but the things have started to improve in Ukraine. And again, since 2014, Ukrainians have started, like, for example, traveling more to the West. So they received a visa-free travel to the West. So they started bringing all the best from the West. So this is why we're talking about people started electing new young leaders who were like becoming the local leaders. And if you look at the cities, this changes started happening. And all of a sudden, like, people in Russia were like, oh, wait a minute, like Ukraine is not doing that badly,
Yeah.
right? So, but there's a lot of propaganda was coming through as well.
Let me ask you though, because about this issue, I think it's still deeper than that. And obviously, I'm biased. You're biased. We don't have a Russian here to defend themselves or give that opinion. But the idea of there really being some difference of who is susceptible to propaganda, I think it's more than that for Russians. I think they just generally want to believe the nonsense that they have. Because I'll remind our viewers that one of the first things Putin did in 2000 was he took the private news channel of one of the people that got him elected, oligarch Boris Berezovsky. The next year, he took NTV from another oligarch that got him elected, Gusinsky, And then in 2003, he did his first major takeover of an oil company, Yukos, with Hordikovsky's company. So from the beginning, I mean, and the Putin's Palace, that thing on the Black Sea, that was already started in like 2002 or 2003, according to the Navalny team. So people still don't like to buy, Tucker Carlson's, the asshole Putin lickers, according to Zelensky's word there. They still believe that somehow Putin's like just some genuine, and Lex Friedman sells this bullshit too, right? That Putin's just some genuine guy, always like did it for his people. But anybody in the West could see, if you paid attention, you could see that he was from the beginning building up his oligarchy, his technocracy, his autocracy with just whoever was in his group from the 90s, his little St. Petersburg mafia group. They were the people that were going to stay around. And it's like, if you're in the U.S. or whatever, you could think about whatever government channel in Europe that there's a few different main government stations, a few private stations, right, for news and stuff. In the U.S., the example of say a hard right, or not, typically farther right, would be the Fox News. It's like if there was only Fox News 24/7, just blaring through your radio and on your TV. That's what this gerontocracy, as you're talking about, the old guard hears every day in Russia. But even saying all of that, I think if you had that in Ukraine, they would still not believe it. They would not fall for it. They would just be, they're different. I don't know. Tell me why it is that Ukraine, even as much as they are blasted with Russian propaganda, and the Russian propaganda is blasted through the Baltics, but it's still, I mean, we're, like I said, we're immune to it. Why is it that Ukraine can turn the page and just get away from this sort of megaphone of Putin Orwellian hellscape, but the Russians just allow themselves to be taken by it? They just allow themselves to say, no, it can't be that bad. We can't be murdering and raping and deporting your children. It just can't be that way. Is it only the propaganda, or they just have something inherent in their little reptilian, Orwellian, empirical mindset that they feel that it's just, we might as well support it?
Okay, 70% of Russians never left their region.
Yeah,
So it's only
good
like
point.
they say
That's a good point.
about less than 30% of Russians have an international passport. Only about 20% of them have actually traveled outside of Russia. Most of that 20% comes from a very few places, right? Out of those 20%, very few have traveled for the like really say let's say culture exchange experience. So they will go and look at historic culture. So they will go to Rome and they will see all the Roman palaces, but they never speak to the people who live in Rome. So like they have very little interaction with the rest of the world. And quite often, even when they live abroad, so I do know some people from Russia, and you know, mostly they were ladies, and like some of them were friendly with, and they just say, "Look, don't tell me this stuff. I just want to believe what my dad tells me." Right? So, and these are the people who live in England. They've been to, there's a friend of mine, she's
Mm.
been to Russia, and she ran away from there screaming, like, posting how bad things were in the town where she's from. And now she would be telling you how it's the West that, makes the Russia bad. They don't want to believe that, yeah, wait a minute, we can change things. So, very different psyche to Ukrainians. Another thing is Russia is very big. So quite often people like when we talk about Maidan in Ukraine, right? The second one especially. What many Westerners they don't understand what happened. What happened was that a bunch of kids were essentially standing in the main square,
Mm-hmm.
protesting the fact that the government has broke down the treaty with Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and they were not causing any trouble, nothing else. And then somebody decided that a good idea would be to psych up the police force and then send them in to beat up those kids.
Soviet style.
Well, not even so. That
Russian
stuff like
style?
this.
Russian style?
More like, yeah, Russian, more like even like, China, was it that Pyongyang Square? I don't remember. Like, remember what the square is
Tiananmen.
called? Yeah,
Tiananmen Square.
yeah, right. Similar stuff. So it's like, not tanks, but they came in heavy. Like this, if you watch videos from this, there's a video somewhere where a young guy, he gets knocked down. Some guy runs in, just this guy's trying to scramble up. As the police officer, like, this is a big guy running through with this big stick, and he just goes at him and just whacks him with a stick. Somebody runs and kicks him,
Yeah.
and they don't even, like, looking where they kick him, they just kind of kick him in the face, like, boom. And they come in into that square, and this guy's kids, like, there's nobody, I don't think there was many people there over the age of like 22. So most of them younger,
Yeah.
right? We're talking like just out of school. Some maybe even still in school because they were in Kiev and they just, right, not making any mass, any fuss, they just standing there. These
Yep.
guys come in and they beat them up. Like we're talking ambulances, people having their arms broken,
Yeah.
and there's like,
True autocracy, like what happened to the Hong Kong protesters. I mean, true no human
yeah,
rights, no right to assemble. You have nothing. We're just going to put you down. That was the democratically elected Yanukovych government,
yeah.
ladies and gentlemen. I mean, it's
And
like people don't have
the
a right to stand up and resist that. It's just
Yeah,
this.
if they did that in Moscow, maybe some people would go out to protest that.
Mm,
In Ukraine, because you can, like, for Ukrainians driving for like, 1,000 kilometers, we can do that in the night. We don't mind, it's like, especially about something like this. Now we're pissed.
yeah, it was like
So
not our children. I mean, that was what got the parents up in arms.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
it was you're not touching the children. Like, you remember when the kids got picked up in Moscow. Maybe it wasn't as violent, but when they were getting picked up in Moscow, there was a big
when was
youngsters
this?
protest. A couple about 2015, I guess. The
Because there
Bolotna,
was
the
things would
Bolotna
that
abortion.
was yeah, like, and a quick reminder as well. Some people might know this, but like things started to go bad in Moscow precisely before Putin's reelection in
Yeah,
2012. That was when everybody was like, all right, he's really going to do this. He's full on going autocrat. And so that's all the guys, Navalny, Milov, Kasparov, all of them were there protesting, huge protests in front of the Kremlin in 2011. And then after Putin got in, he's like, all right, never again. So all that stuff, like 2014, Pussy Riot was rioting against the weaponizing of the Orthodox Church. And I don't know if the particular event that you're talking about, but this is the environment where it started to be like basically you can't protest with more than two people in a public square. So anyway,
yeah.
they probably got violent with some kids, and then the
They didn't get
sheeple that are
super
the Russians
violent.
just let it go.
Yeah, they didn't get super violent, but no, none of the parents came out.
Yeah.
Nobody, even the
So
ones that
why
live in
why
the north.
I think people need to understand that, and even myself, I need to understand that. Why are they so submissive? Why are they so cynical? Why are they so
They don't see an
afraid?
alternative. They do not see an alternative. Like I said, Ukrainians, we had access to Europe. Like, even if the Ukrainians did not get a free, like, visa-free travel in Europe, there is still plenty of Ukrainians that are working in Europe. Like, when I was coming back to Ukraine from Europe, like, I'd go and I'd be invited to, like, my teachers from my school, say, hey, come over, have a chat with our kids, tell them about your experience. But so Ukrainians have had a bit more sober understanding of Europe.
Mm,
Like I said, the fact that Europeans have started getting a visa-free travel to Ukraine, so the Europeans be it in places where they're like, people went, wait, what are you saying? Like, wait, what, what language is this? Like, we don't understand you. And then somebody comes up and like, oh, you speak in English, right? I
yeah,
speak English. I can translate. Like, they started having all those ideas available to them, and they were like, wait a
yeah.
minute, we can have changes. Russian populations generally don't have that. we were talking with a friend of mine who's from Russia. I said, and he was like, we were talking to him, and I was saying the Russians don't even have a proper access to the internet. And he was like, wait a minute, this technologically everything is there. I said, yes, but to have access to internet and to the ideas and things like this, you have to be able to access more than just Russian internet. You
Yeah.
have to be able to understand at least another language, which most of the Russians don't. And the access is there if you have a smartphone. And even with smartphones being very cheap, many older generations still don't have them. And let's be honest, like, when we were trying to set this up and like, we were trying to see if we can run through a smartphone the video, and it's like I'm holding this smartphone right in my face. It's really uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Like try reading news articles from your smartphone. Like tiny text,
Yeah.
nearly unreadable. So you can maybe watch some videos, and as well, like probably not gonna watch a big factor videos. You probably watch something small, like and again, you will very little understanding. So they did not have that. The younger
Yeah.
generations of Ukrainians did. Another thing is what happened is Ukrainians had to change because they did not have the oil money. So the businesses had to change. The
Yeah.
enterprises had to change. They had to build up. Just to give you an example, so until 2015, Russians could not build their own trains, right? They
They still can't
um,
do mostly anything
oh
foreign.
they after 2015 for about 6 years they could,
Hmm.
but
But they had help. They had Western consultants that would come in and
oh
help
no
them.
no no that's even funnier than that. In 2014, obviously they captured Lugansk,
Hmm.
and in Lugansk there was a train building factory which magically disappeared by 2015. And in 2015,
It was those
Russians
damn
have
Maidan
started.
protesters. Yeah.
Yeah, another wonderful fact. I don't know if that thing still exists, but in 2015, Russians have managed to start producing some of the biggest artificial gemstones, like rubies, I think,
Okay.
from 2015. Why they this? But it's a very interesting fact. In 20, 2012, in 2013, there was a Ukrainian semi-oligarch, Kurechkin, his last name. He was also from Donetsk, right? And he opened a factory in Donetsk, which surprisingly had been supplying every major anywhere, most of the major watch manufacturers in Europe and probably on the planet with artificial rubies to use for the glass, this non-break, non-scratch glass on your watch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. Chances, there's about 80% chance that came out until 2014, that came out of Ukraine, that glass.
Hmm.
Then Russians took over Donetsk, and less than a year later, all of a sudden, they opened a brand new factory in Russia. They had a crystal university, crystal institute, which didn't exist. And then in 2015, it gets a new place. I don't remember the name of the city, and they start producing the biggest crystals in the world. Right, the factory was
Wow.
by,
Wow.
and
I
like
hadn't heard that.
a lot of things like this. Yeah, it's like so a lot of technology they were like taking over. One other thing people forgetting is that in 2012, 2013, shale gas was found in Ukraine. So
Yeah.
Ukraine nearly
That's
signed a
absolutely
contract.
That's absolutely in Putin's
Yeah,
view. And then Trump, of course, says he wants rare earth minerals. But if he wants Ukraine to bargain their rare earth minerals away, they're going to have to go into the eastern territories to get them, as far as I understand. So I'm curious
many
what
of them.
Trump is
Yeah,
going for there.
but the thing is like, but when we talk to Russians, but you talk when you talk to Russians, like you give them facts and they go, no, 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 this can't be right. This is not our TV didn't say that. So they do not have the access, and quite often, like I say, we're all humans. I know this because I'm simply a little bit interested. But ask me on any other subject, which may like you talk about cryptocurrencies. Like I know just a little bit what I heard on TV. That's not my. So I'm sure there are people who do cryptocurrencies or they will know things about cryptocurrencies that I've never even heard of. But it's like so.
Well, it's a whole other topic, but
Yeah, but
yeah,
what I'm
go ahead.
saying is that if you have your everyday life, unless you actually like reading, for example, books on history or something like this, or you like a little bit antisocial like me, but tend to have a mind to remember some random fact which you've done like 20 years ago, and it just comes up, and you go like, "Oh, I remember that." Like you will not really know those things. Like let's be honest. Like most of the Americans, they might recognize the name Zelensky because he's like still all over the newspapers.
Mm,
But if I say the name Kuchma, they will
mm,
go, "Who?"
yeah, yeah.
Like, I mean, ask me about
First
most of the
president, right? First president of Ukraine
second
post.
actually.
Ah, second. Well, that was close.
Well, I believe he was the longest serving one. The
Yeah,
long, but that's what I'm saying. Is like unless you're interested in this subject, like unless I sit down and learn about like what was happening in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, like over the last few years, like somebody asked me about the president names of any of those countries, I'll be perplexed, even now, like because like I say, this is I keep track of Ukraine, and this is something like when I was talking, like I mentioned before, like sometimes when I go back to Ukraine, I'd speak to school kids, and when they were saying to me like, "How do you understand that you're Ukrainian?" and I was saying, "Look, I don't really care who rules in Russia, but I
yeah,
care who's the president of Ukraine. I don't really care what happens in whichever city in Russia somewhere, like in Siberia. Like honestly, like if they're doing well, I'm happy for them. I care what's happening in Kherson, where I'm from. Where my grandmother lived now, and my grandfather. Like I care about those things a bit more than I care about what's happening in like like if there's a problem, if there's like a big party in Krishatek, I care about. If there's a big party in Red Square, I would know about.
right.
And this is how I was like, very quickly kind of decide, oh, wait a minute, I am not Russian. I don't really care about what's going on. It's like, and this is how you probably know about more about so many places where you've been, and you go like, I know about this. But if we start talking about, for example, life in Paris or life in like I don't know back streets of London, if you've
Yeah.
never been there, you would say, well, I've heard something, but a lot of stuff you will probably be able to relate to because a lot of stuff I would speak to, you kind of say, okay, we might have similar problems in the US, but we will not be, you will not be going like, oh, wait, I know exactly. Like if I name some streets where, like maybe I lived in London, something like this, it's not something that will come to your mind. Oh, I know this place.
And it's a fair point, of course, to always bring it back to the Western audience, which I am mostly speaking to, and you are as well, because we're speaking English, and we want to try to bring awareness and help to Ukraine. And I speak about it on my podcast occasionally, but like you said, we focus more on Bitcoin and individual freedom and liberty a lot, mostly. But the thing that I find is interesting is that if you just push that veneer a little bit about like for a Westerner or someone that doesn't know about Ukraine, um, they're so pleasantly surprised always when they talk to a Ukrainian, they speak to a Ukrainian, they learn any interesting thing about Ukrainian fact or whatever. And then you ask them to try and go and do the same with Russia. And it's just generally, you're going to find darkness and cynicism and probably something that's just completely fake, like a Tucker Carlson interview of Putin. It really is remarkable. And the battle is still very tough. And I think it's getting more front and center now because the U.S. is basically, as we talked about, they're retreating. They're retreating from the unipolar order. Trump is trying to do it on his own terms or however he feels like he wants to do it. Some people think he's going to be more autocratic. Some people think maybe he'll just be more businesslike. And like we talked about, maybe he will arm Ukraine to the teeth if Putin negotiations fail. So a lot of question marks still there. And I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt because if we ask, where are we right now, 3 years post February 22, I would say unquestionably, in spite of Ukrainian heroism, we are still, Ukraine is fighting with one arm tied behind their back, and it's just very difficult. So I'm certainly giving Trump the benefit of the doubt that he can actually, not really. I'm trying to not look at what he says and talk about Gaza hotels and, I mean, God forbid what he would try to trade away for, Ukraine or later the Baltics or Georgia or Moldova. But I guess my question to you is, are you and other Ukrainians that you speak with, are you hopeful that we might make the right decisions here? Or are you doubtful? And if things do go, not according to plan, or if somehow you're forced into negotiations where you have to give up, at least temporarily, all the occupied territories, you have to shrink your army, you have to do all these things. Do you think the fighting will stop, or do you think Ukraine would keep fighting on?
My issue, like whichever way this war stops, like I said, I have a very different view on certain things. My problem is what's going to happen in Russia because many people kind of go like, yes, we're going to have the, but the Russian people are not going to get any richer. The infrastructure is failing, and now you're going to have like they already start having these problems like because if you listen to the Russian speaking channels, it becomes like a daily thing where the people who come back from war they do all sorts of crazy stuff. Like these people, like anybody who has been through even the fist fight, we all know it can be like a very very traumatic experience, especially if you had your ass kicked. But imagine going through the war. Imagine going through those meat grinders and surviving. Like, and these people are gonna come back. And when this war was starting, I said, "Look, guys, you know what? Just remember that once this war finishes, we will be accepting refugees from Russia, and we're actually gonna feel sorry for them. That's how bad things gonna happen. That's gonna happen there." We already mentioned today that a lot of reasons to attack Ukraine was because Ukraine was doing like better and because the Russian propaganda was failing. And now with this war, not only the Russian propaganda is failing, but their whole system is failing. It's crumbling.
Mm.
While the war happens, or if they have a very, very, very good, push that, yes, the West came in, they still might be able to hold the country together. But my issue is that there will be a lot of men who come back, and you probably remember the like Afghanistan, soldiers that went through Afghanistan,
Mm-hmm.
and the issues they were like. There were not that many, like it's quite a few, but obviously in a kind of red of Soviet Union, there are not that many, and still that issues that came with.
You mean for the Russians that went to Afghanistan, or the
No,
Soviet, I should say?
For the soldiers when they came back.
Yeah, and it's not just Russians, by the way. That was
Yeah,
Soviets. So
they were not just
Latvians
Russians. Yeah, there was all
Ukrainians.
sorts of
Yeah.
people. And if you look at those, like what was happening there. It's like most of the people in the West they don't know, but I remember the issues those guys were causing. And like in my home city, there were a few, but it's like but still not that many, and still people go like, oh wait, this guy's like what, don't hustle him. He's been through Afghanistan. Not the guy is not in a good place. Imagine all those guys that went through all the bad places like proper war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the difference is that Ukrainian soldiers, they know that what they're fighting for. They know what they're coming back to. Many of them, I expect that we will see a very big changes in Ukraine after the war because those soldiers are proactive. Even like in these situations, in these bad conditions, like let's be honest, through the commanding officers, through social media, through other ways, they still get what needs to be, what needs to be done. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, when we talked about that they pushed the decision was pushed through that they're not building any more new regiments. They're sending the soldiers into old experienced regiments. Now they said, look, no more new buildings. We're gonna train the soldiers, and then we'll like when the regiment comes out, we're gonna fill it up with new soldiers. They're gonna train together, and this is what's gonna happen now in Ukraine. It took a while, but they got that, right? And also, we already seen that, like we talked with you today, more younger people came into power in Ukraine in many places, right? And in the new places, all the old guys again, they're gonna move on. So there will be a lot of places where the soldiers will be able to say, "Hey, I was in the war." Like we're not saying it's gonna be all perfect, it's like, but we're gonna see that kind of push where they will say, we see something, we fought for something better. We're gonna try and do that because in Ukraine they already have experience of achieving that. In Russia they don't. So they're coming back, like I say, in the towns and cities with a failing infrastructure, next to no jobs. And again, this is something I talked about, for example, in my videos, where at the start of the 22, when the companies have started closing down like their factories in Russia and stuff like this.
Mm.
And I was saying, and this is when they were starting to pay people to join the army. And I was saying, look, guys, there's like give it a few months, so until about December 2022, and like end of autumn, beginning of winter 2022, and you will see more and more people becoming soldiers for money because they don't have anywhere else to go. They've lost their jobs because those jobs were paid for by Western companies and now they're closed down. Like IKEA closed all its shops, like all of a sudden you have tens of thousands of men whose best skill was to lift things up in a warehouse,
Mm.
coming out, getting out of work, or then getting jobs for like less than $100 a month. And all those guys were slowly, they had some savings, but they were slowly going and going and going into the Russian army. This is why many people, when people say, oh, we don't believe there was like 30,000 Russians a month signing up contracts with Russian army for the money, I say, well, actually they were because there is nothing else in many places. And now these guys are going to come back to in Ukraine, they'll be coming back and they'll be coming back to some bad, maybe bad opportunities, but opportunities nevertheless. We already see the interest from Europeans to say, hey, wait, like you mentioned, uh, all the natural resources that are right there in Ukraine on the border with Europe. We are talking shale gas, we are talking like the rare earth materials, but we're also talking about jobs in agricultural industry. We're talking jobs in building, we're talking jobs in many other, like, producing something, like, a lot of this big industry, which is now evolved in Ukraine for making different drones.
Mm-hmm.
which now it's like this a lot of like this is not gonna exist in Russia. So when these people gonna go back to Russia, they're gonna have like some money through their time in the military, but that's gonna run out fast. What happens then? I mean, like we say, people who came out of Afghanistan, but they were tens of thousands. This is hundreds of thousands. And they were Afghanistan was tens of thousands spread not just around Russia, but also Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, all of those places. Right? This was like they were all over, but this is like nearly a million people who had either went through war who managed to survive, people who got injuries. Like if you look at
2 million. Could be 2 million.
yeah, all take all of that and now imagine them coming back into Russia, where many places, like we mentioned today, many towns like have lost over 50% of their population. Smaller towns and villages are being taken off the map because nobody's living there. Like the guy who went to war was the last guy there.
Yeah.
And this is gonna happen. What do you think is gonna happen in Russia? No matter how this war ends, like even if they manage to keep those territories, and then they say, we have to keep our troops in those territories,
Mm. Yeah.
they're still not fixing up the economy. I
Yeah.
understand that most people who watch us, they don't listen to the Russian channels, they don't know Russian. But even the guy we talk, Michael Naki, he was showing the videos of people protesting last winter
Oh yeah.
because their houses gone cold because the pipes blew up.
Complete frozen tundra of Soviet
Yeah,
buildings from a Jason Bourne movie. If you're trying to envision this, I mean, just old, decrepit, already 50
yes,
years past their lifespan buildings that the pipes would freeze and the whole walkway would be frozen inside.
yes. What most of the people probably didn't pay attention. Those those buildings were 20 kilometers from Moscow.
Yeah,
They were
that's a salient point right there. I mean, that's a
that
salient
that was
point.
not somewhere in like little town in
Novosibirsk.
the
Yeah,
that was like 20 kilometers from Moscow.
yeah. Tucker Carlson's
Again,
dream city.
yeah, but the thing is again, let's look at people like Tucker Carlson. They go to places like Moscow. They go a couple of other places. They go in there, and Tucker Carlson goes, "Oh, look, I can buy bread here for $1." Okay,
at a
wonderful.
French at a French grocer with
Yeah,
imported
but the
ingredients.
the, the question is, I'm not even gonna go there. I'm not like I'm gonna say you can buy this
Sure.
brand, wonderful.
I'm just chiming in, Yuri. Sorry.
Yeah, but the question is, what is the wage for most of the people in Moscow? Can they actually? How many of them can afford to spend that $1?
Yeah.
And that's just Moscow. If you go outside of Moscow, when the things were good, the 300 many places $350 was considered a very good wage.
Yeah.
So if Tucker Carlson comes to those places and he says, "Well, I can buy this," it's like I also watch some channels by like was it American veteran who went to Russia. He's found himself a Russian girlfriend. It's wonderful. He goes into this town and he can says, "Look, I found this flat, such a wonderful flat, and I can buy it for only $30,000." But it's wonderful, except that most of the people in this town make only 300 or less. So he's telling how great Russia is because he can buy a flat for $30,000, but he comes there with his American pension, American military pension. So I don't think he's getting less than a couple of $1,000 a month.
Yeah.
So when you have that and you come to the place where the good income is $300 a month, you're a king, right? You come in there, it's like, and all of a sudden you're making in a month more than most of the business people in that region.
Yeah.
Like
And let's try
you're,
to. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, it's like so same as like so, and people come in, and again, they only come into Moscow. They only come in like in Russia. They will only come in. There's a one city, forgot its name, Vladivostok. My father studied there. Like
Yeah.
you
Over
go
in
to
the east.
Vladivostok, and people say, "Well, it became a wonderful city." And then you listen. I was listening to a Russian guy who lives in Japan, and he said, "I went to Vladivostok. It's so great." And then he went to a city nearby, so it's like another like bigger center. And he says that city is still got like he went in a hotel in that city, and he said they still got your beds in there from USSR.
Sure.
Like,
100%. Yeah.
and he's so you have a few places where foreigners come in, but they don't see much else. And when they go to those places, the amount of income they receive, they can afford to live like nowhere else. Like it's why many people, Russian speakers, for example, who used to be out of Russia, the ones, for example, in Germany, many people when they lived in Germany long enough and they can receive a German pension, which is over €1,000, they say, you know what? Why do I stay here? Many go back to Russia, for example, and they settle in somewhere in a town like in the Russia, but he goes to this town and he's getting three times the amount of most of the people. Many
Yeah.
people in Russia make even less. So when people say, "Oh, Russia is so wonderful to me," people are just like you go like, "Yeah, but like let's do the calculations." Like when some farmers from Australia, I believe I watched a video, they were saying, "Oh, we sold our land in Australia and we came to Russia and we could buy like 50 times the land for like less than one tenth of the price." Great, but Australia prices, Australia wages, Russia wages. Australia land, not that much land. Russian land where there's just nobody there to walk on that land anymore.
Right.
Because people who walk on that land who don't have that starting capital often simply go bankrupt. You know, and that's what the West does not. People in the West who tell about how great Putin is, they don't generally see any of that. So they go to Moscow, they see all the new builds, all the new buildings. Because they don't speak Russian, they don't listen to the Russian commentators who say, but all these buildings have been built on that.
Yep.
So now the companies that build those buildings who are trying to sell them because they don't get any government assistance because of the war, maybe companies are about to go bankrupt. And of course, nobody's talking about that. Nobody's saying where is this coming from.
Yeah. Yuri,
Nobody's
let me ask you about this. Let's pull on this thread, and we're getting close to 3 hours here. This is a very good conversation. I will unfortunately have to go soon, but actually, this is I think a good way to wind it down. Is we're talking about sort of say we do get to some freeze or whatever, some peace. Who knows if it'll happen or not? I tend to think that Ukrainians are going to keep fighting and not get a good deal, but let's see. I don't know, and you know, but let's say actually that there is a freeze and we get through a Trump term and we get through another whatever 10 years. Talk about we're talking about the Russians or young Russians and kind of the way that they live and how disastrous their economy and country has always been, regardless. And then Ukrainians who obviously have suffered tremendously, but they have something to come back to. They're fighting and they'll continue to fight. I heard Dmytro Kuleba said something. I think it was on the Kiev Independence, like a podcast. He said, "This is recently." He said, "If we can't find some sort of a deal, And he was trying to reference all sort of historic. It's not like this is the first time this has happened, right? We have like Alsace-Lorraine. We have plenty of places around Europe. Obviously, everything that's going on in around Poland and Kaliningrad used to be Königsberg. Russia had nothing to do with that area. Uh, Lands have traded hands plenty of times in European history. But his point was, if we get into some pros and long-term conflict and there's no lasting peace with security guarantees for Ukraine and perhaps even NATO to hold Ukraine back, he thinks that in like 10 years, you could have some revanchist young Ukrainians that are going to be super pissed and super angry, going back to what we just talked about, and want to push the fight further back into Russia. And then on the flip side, my question would be, what does a Russian army look at that point? I know that everybody's saying, and I agree with this, by the way, that a frozen peace is bad. It's going to allow Putin time to rebuild his army, this and that. So I certainly think that the Western pressure for, liberty and sovereignty and, safe borders for Ukraine should be pushed as far as we can push it. But, assuming that we get into some sort of a frozen conflict over the next 10 years, do you see something like that happen where possibly young Ukrainians are going to just, they're going to be out for blood, to put it one way or another, and want to go back and push out Russians from the occupied regions and then start a new conflict all over again? And then how the Russian army looks at that point, I don't know. But to me, over the long term still, even though Ukraine has been up against it so much, with all the Western support, with all the young Ukrainians that both live in Ukraine and abroad, and the fact that they've been holding Russia to, like a kilometer a month for 3 years, whatever the average has been, which is incredible. Everything that you said about Russia makes it seem to me that young Russians have nothing to live for, and young Ukrainians are going to have everything to live for, but there's still going to be an unanswered end to this conflict. So how do you see, if that scenario holds, where we get to some Trump, Putin, whatever, I don't know, frozen conflict, do you think that, yeah, how do you see both sides in the future there, the young generations looking in 10 years?
If, let's say, that Trump has agreed to a ceasefire, there's no more missiles flying into Ukraine, right? So no drones, no missiles, no bombings, right? And we going under the pretense that, yes, Russia has kept the territory, but it did not fall apart. Okay, so again, this is big ifs.
Sure.
It also depends. Like, if you look at the history, for example, the reason why many Afghans were pissed off with the West is they got assistance to fight the Soviets. I think it was like a very good phrase. It was Charlie's War, the movie, remember? And they give a quote that we won the war, but we fucked up the end game, right? And that's where it comes through. Is like, if if we're not even talking US, we're talking EU, right?
Mm-hmm.
If that cultural exchange happens with the EU, where Ukrainians have the opportunities to go and try different things, where and Ukraine slowly becomes part of the EU, you're probably not going to have a generation of pissed off Ukrainians. They will be pissed off, but they're not going to be going like, "Hey, let's go and fight the war." Not in the sense of a hot war that we have. But what will be is a very like there will be a push. We don't want to be like Russians. We want to move forward. We don't want to go backwards. There's a very different, again, something we discussed with my Russian friends, and many Russians will confirm that, was that any Russians who would stay in the villages on the border with Ukraine when the peace was there, they would go and buy products. So they would travel to Ukraine and buy products from Ukrainian villages. That was like an ongoing. They said, look, we tried buying stuff from the Russian farmers and we bought stuff from Ukrainian farmers. Completely different taste.
Mm.
And there's a very that change in difference in cultures. Like it's a very long-standing difference in culture. But I was saying to like, if you talk to Ukrainians, especially from the eastern Ukraine, quite often you can differentiate the villages where it's a Ukrainian village or whether it's so-called Russian village. So I was like, and the difference was like if you go into the village and all the fences are painted, people have got grapes growing above it, the streets are reasonably tidy, nothing is thrown in front of the houses, like everything kept in order. Yeah, that's a Ukrainian village. You go to the village where the fences are not painted, they're fallen over, the buildings are old, it's like they're not often in a bit of a disrepair state. You go, that's a Russian village.
Yeah, there's not even a garbage like route disposal. I mean, the garbage is heaped up on the
No,
outside of the city.
no, it's not just
Not even
that.
on the
It's like
outside of the
it's
city.
it's the little things, and you look at this and you notice
Yeah.
that, and you notice the differences in approaches,
I'm not
and
being facetious there. I'm saying, if you look at some of those Russian villages, they don't. There's no connection. There's no
yeah,
civilization coming in. The trash is heaped up somewhere on the
but
side of the village. City is the wrong word to use there.
the thing is, some of these villages, like we talk about Russia, the issue is not in the village itself; it's in the local government, obviously. But we're talking about every day what people do, and it's like Ukrainians would paint their fences and like people in the around their buildings. And like, why do you do this? Well, if you paint your fence, it costs you like the general old thing was they would use the paint that would keep the bugs out because the fences used to be wooden, and you would use this white paint which is very toxic for the bugs, so they wouldn't eat your fence, right? And that kind of continued. And now, if you have a metal fence, if you paint it every 2 years, for example, right, it doesn't rust. So 10 years down the line, you still have a perfectly good fence. Obviously, it's not such a big place around your house, so like maybe a little bit different to the American ranches, which is go for miles and miles and miles. But when you have it around just a little piece of land around your building, if you paint, it's like, and these are the little things. Like for example, I was talking to my uh, uncle. It's kind of a mixed family, but and his wife, and she was like going like, look, we you can like they have a family which were like specifically pro-Russian and everything else, and they would when you milk the cow, if you keep the milk for like 2 or 3 hours, there's like this white thing that I don't remember, like white cream that collects on the top of the milk, right? And then what you do is you collect what Ukrainians would do is they would collect the cream, put it in the thing, and then sell the milk to the milkman. And she was saying like, and we would use that cream for cooking and things like this. And there's a Russian family, and they would milk their cow, and they would sell the milk directly, straight away. And then they would go and to the shop and buy cream from the shop. And the whole village was saying, "What are you doing?" Like, everybody was like, "What are you doing? This is insane. You can get cream from your milk and then sell the
Yeah.
milk." It's kind of like that little difference is like in culture, and that culture has been built over hundreds of years. Like those little differences, like once one of the things I said, the first written constitution in Europe was actually written in Kiev,
Yep.
100 years,
I'm
100
aware of
years
this.
before 100 years before Magna Carta. So it's like most of the people in the West, they don't know. They kind of go like, even many Russians go like, really? Like, is this really? It's like, yes, it was like written in Kiev by, and then you have that history going through the Ukraine, and then you have the history of like, let's make the land people as enslaved as possible through the Russian Tsars, and the territory of Ukraine was like always it wasn't independent, but it was kind of this kind of weird area with like everybody tried to own it. So there's a lot of fighting going on. So you can't really put slaves in there because as soon as you do that, they run away. You need people living there that are capable of defending themselves. And so this builds a very different culture, like,
Well, before 1795, it was the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, and you had the Cossacks had a seat at the table eventually, and of course, it's a very complicated history, but that's a fascinating little. Basically the Baltics, Belarus, and Ukraine, all of that, and Poland, all of that land is in some different times, basically for 500 years, was either the Grand Duchy of
changing.
Lithuania or the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. So it's
Yeah,
it's
so
a
it's been,
shared history.
yeah, there's been a lot of fighting there. Like,
Yeah.
but this creates like a very different approaches to, and like for example, Ukraine and Poland, like two nearby countries, but Poland is very much influenced by also the religion in Poland, and so you see a little bit also very free loving people, but a little bit more how to put organized than Ukrainians. So Ukrainians were like bit more essentially in those centuries, like if you're talking about like terms of Cossacks, Ukraine was somewhat a bit of a very like semi-aggressive equivalent of US. So people who wanted to get away from their masters,
Mm,
from Russia, from Poland, even,
mm,
or people who wanted to join like military, like Cossacks, as people that would leave military service in Swiss Guard to
yep.
go and join Cossacks.
Yep.
So that was like a place where people who kind of wanted that kind of feeling of yes, we're free, we're chaotic, but we're free and we do like we have this land of work. They would go that to that area, which was like mostly like modern Ukraine and Kuban River, like those areas, kind of like. So it was literally like people from those areas. Like another funny fact, the Battanian musketeers were based on Cossacks.
Mm.
Like very few
Didn't
people
know that.
know that,
No, I
but
didn't know
yeah,
that.
the French king has hired Cossacks
Mm.
to fight for him because the Cossacks would like go fight, get become they were a bit of mercenaries as well, and they fought for the French king. They essentially ended the Hundred-Year War in France.
Yep.
Between the that little town, the city that became a fortress, and French king couldn't capture it. And it was the very well-known Ukrainian Cossack leader that managed to capture that fortress.
Mm.
They managed to kind of cheat, they tricked the French because the Ukrainian ships were very low in the very, they didn't go too deep in the water, so they managed to jump the chains that held the French ships out of the city, and Ukrainians managed to jump it, and they fought their way through and opened the gates, and hence the war was finished. So the
Yeah.
guys, and based on those guys, the idea of musketeers came about. So the musketeers were actually, and the I think it was this blue thing they were wearing. The name for that is Kazakin.
Yeah. Cossack.
So
Yep.
it's kind of like very, so Ukrainians did play a big role in European history, but because of that, they had a very different influence than the Russians did, and this created a culture. So it's like Ukrainians don't will not generally try to go into war. We don't. We're a bit more peaceful. We're chaotic.
You never invaded one country from 1991, where Russian invaded like five, including its own. So
Yeah, but we, but also many people we can Ukrainians can be like very how to put pushy in their ways. So for example, again a story very few people know, but this is why I'm looking forward to the future of Ukraine. Is that a few years back it was in Mykolaiv, a couple of police officers have actually kidnapped and raped the girl, and they left her for dead. And it was a town, so she managed to get away. They thought she was dead, and then they came back to finish her off, but she managed to get away. And she managed to get to the people, and she told them who's done it. It's like so the people collect, gathered around the police station and saying, "Hey, these guys, they're going like they're gonna get in, you know."
Mm.
But it was all about like we know these guys did it. We want them arrested. We want them in court. And the police officer again like the guy who came from the '90s era, like and he decided, yeah, you know what, we're the police. You're nobody. You should just take what's given and whatever. Right? So a bunch of people got together with shotguns and basically shot up a police station.
When was this?
That was, I would say, it was about 2007, 2008.
Mm.
So it was like, so that side of Ukrainians is like, yeah, willing to fight for what, people
Yeah.
believe they like, they're defending themselves. Like same reason, same as we were talking about 2013.
Yeah.
That you're
Not
gonna
going to
get
roll over
beaten
to
up.
authority
Yeah, 10
if you start
million
attacking
people go out.
kids.
Yeah, 10 million people go out on the streets.
Yep.
Like Tucker Carlson will say, oh no, there's some guy who apparently wrote a book how Americans have paid for Ukrainians to do the revolution in 2013, 2014. And
Is this
according to
Scott
the,
Horton's book, Provoked? Scott Horton's book,
some,
Provoked? It's one of the more embarrassing takes, yeah. I mean,
yeah,
he's terrible. I mean, facts are
it's,
not germane, nor are they really facts about the
and the thing
situation.
is like, according to the Russian sources, like any Ukrainian that went and took part in this revolution got paid minimum of $100 a day.
Yep. He's
10 million people, at least 5 million people being active daily. Like over
it's
10 million people taking part in that. Like that's
he's never
like a
been to
billion.
Ukraine. He has no idea. I was at Maidan. I can guarantee you it wasn't Western
Yeah.
Allied funded. It was
But what I'm
grassroots.
saying is
There were
is that
Bitcoin signs there, by the way, for donations. Sorry. Go ahead. I just got to keep throwing those
but,
things in.
but,
Go
but,
ahead.
what I'm saying is that if we just simply take in the money, and apparently Americans were so good that they've spent over $1 billion a day
Mm.
over a space of what is it, 4 months, 4.5 months?
Yeah, the coldest months of winter, and all these Ukrainians came out to collect their
Yeah,
paycheck
yeah,
from
and
the
they were
CIA.
paying. Oh, they've spent over $1 billion a day, so it's over 100 days. Say 120 days, I'd say around that. So 120 days, over $1 billion a day. Wouldn't it be nice if they took that money and spent this on the weapons and gave those weapons to Ukraine right now? If they were
Yeah.
spending that much money
If they have
to
such
get people to
cash that they
go
can
out on
just,
Maidan,
yeah,
like
yeah,
can we please have $120 billion like in one go in 4 months? Like we're
yep.
not talking like 4 years.
No, I've
Can
I've
we
talked
have
about I've talked about it many times, and I don't know. We should end it, Yuri. It's this is really interesting, but I gotta close it at some point.
uh,
But one more thing. I mean, while we're at it, just putting these stereotypes. I mean, the one that I hate tremendously is the idea that you're going to call Ukrainians Nazis. And in half of his book, he spends like I did a word count or something. It was literally like every 5 pages the word Nazi came up in his book. Um, and this guy's wife, we find out later, is uh, a Ukrainian Jewish refugee, came over from the Refusnik time in the 80s, uh, and she gave an interview in March 2022, the first month of when Ukraine was being firebombed, and about 10 days before the Russians were, embarrassingly had to leave Kiev because they're so corrupt and disorganized and badly led and just generally terrible at everything they try. But she went on this podcast and she was fiercely, fiercely defending the idea that uh, if you call a Ukrainian in any shape or form a Nazi, that is pure Russian propaganda. It's pure bullshit. And she thinks it's offensive. She said in her soul, it's offensive to her. This is this guy's wife who wrote this book called Provoked. How, America started the, whole war in Ukraine. It's all America's fault. Again, it's just pure Russian disinfo, talking points propaganda. Even if they are deluded to believe that somehow they're not sopping up this propaganda. But anyway, it was an incredible interview to listen to. I tweeted about it. I would encourage people to look that up and do some research about, it's either blatant hypocrisy or schizophrenia or just a grift, a massive grift. If you're going to actually, in your family, you're gonna literally go out and publicly say at one point during the darkest days of Ukrainian invasion that this is so disgusting and you cannot even, you know, dare try to say that Ukrainians are Nazis. Like if they're talking about Ukrainian language in schools, that's reclaiming their. It's the same stuff the Baltics had to go through. If you're talking about Ukrainian language in schools, you're reclaiming your heritage from the Russification and the Russian dominance that they experienced for 50 years in the Soviet Union. And obviously, Ukraine had so much more terror than the Baltics. The Holodomor and everything else. But that's just a loathsome character that is loose with his facts and brings up ungermane quotes and I've talked about him many times. He's not even worth my time, frankly, in my opinion. But I would highly encourage people to just push that veneer a little bit more when these people that say, "Oh yeah, Ukrainians are just Nazis and they're just not doing, it's all their fault." Again, they're just whores with a short skirt. You cannot. I feel that in my soul, just like Scott Horton's wife said. That's a visceral reaction that in my soul it's so blatantly false. It hurts so much for a free people trying to liberate their country. And by the way, there's nothing more American, Scott Horton, than getting help from your Western friends to fight your independence. Nothing more American than that, Mr. Historian. So no, these are just loathsome characters. Downright hypocrisy, if not schizophrenia, if not a mega grift. So, sorry, you get me off on these tangents, Yuri. But I have nothing but loathsome things to say about these types of characters.
Yeah, the subject has been quietly removed, and people try not to bother it now. But in the original, and I'm afraid that Ukrainians have failed to properly address it. Now, this is true. Ukrainians, they kind of went like they said, but historically this was not Russian, it was a Soviet propaganda about Ukrainian Nazis. It was done about Stepan Bandera. He was the leader of Ukrainian resistance during the World War II. And technically, if you were to call him a Nazi, you would get 5 to 10 if they really followed their laws in Russia. You would get 5 to 10 years in jail if you were to call Stepan Bandera a Nazi. In Russia, if they follow their own laws, you would have to get 5 to 10 years in jail because they have a very interesting law, and that if you are trying to deny the decision of Nuremberg Court, which judged the Nazis after the World War II, and if you try to change it in any way, the minimum time you get is 5 years. And the Nuremberg Court decision, I don't remember which court book exactly, but has identified Ukrainian independence movement as a separate force in World War II that fought both Nazi Germans and the Soviet Union. The one single point that most of the Soviet propaganda goes to, and this is the event which, if I could find the money, I would make a film about that event, and that was Lviv massacre. Very few Westerners know, kind of, they heard about it, and this is why that one was kind of mixed in a lot of times. And that was the time when when the Germans invaded Soviet Union. When they got into Lviv, there was a big riots by Ukrainians, who would hunt down communists and Jews. It was lasted for about a week, right? And then they died down. What many people don't know is why it happened. So it happened. It's a very dark mark on Ukrainian history, but very few people actually know about this event. And like, I don't know, I'm pretty sure many people who listen to, they probably know a series Firefly. And there's a phrase in there by one of the characters who said, well, you can sometimes meet an evil so powerful that you have no choice but to join it, right? And I would make this movie just to prove this phrase wrong. What happened there was that when the Russians made a pact with Germans, Lviv was part of the Russian influence. But when the Germans attacked, uh, my my grandmother was just traveling from Lviv back to where she was living. But when the Germans attacked, there was a order coming from the had was it? I'm not sure it was Stalin, but definitely it was come from the army, which said basically we have to remove anybody who we consider suspicious and who might act against Soviet Union and help Germans. And that led to pretty much people picked up off the street, and we're not talking some criminals, we're talking like even if if the girl said no to some KGB officer, she would get picked up and thrown into jail ish. So they filled up the jails, and then they went on to massacre thousands of people in those jails. But the descriptions were that there was when people essentially they would close the doors, lock them up, and then they would essentially open that little window, for example, and then the room would be full of people, like chock a block, literally, no way even to see it, and then they would just throw grenades in there. They would shoot
Mm.
people from like they'll put people in the people were in the cages in some jails, like how they show like an American jail, like small jail, which is people kept supposed to be kept there temporary, and it's not like an enclosed room; it's literally just cages. So, and people were thrown in those cages, and they were essentially shot up from machine guns. And when the Germans got into Lviv, they got into those jails, and they're saying that the blood was knee deep in places. People were lying like so. There'll be like one level of people, another people will be brought on top of them, short, another. So they would stack 4 or 5 deep in those cells or in the places. So and the Germans like so I don't remember the guy, but he has this brilliant idea. So what he does is they as soon as they go in there, they let people in first and foremost. So because of this, some people knew that their relatives were picked up and they were thrown in those jails. And then people go in, like people were told that they go in there and then they come out of their grave. And that's how horrific it was. And even the Nazis were like, guys, that's we don't even do that. And this is why one of the and Germans they sent in straight the photographers, the document anything video. They made videos and put photos of those jails, and like within hours, as soon as they go to the printing press, these go into print and they get given to people everywhere. Look, that's what Jews and communists wanted for you. And remember, this is like Lviv is it's a pretty big city, but at the time it's still like so somebody of your friends, relatives probably
Multicultural
got
city.
picked up. It's multicultural, but it's also somebody of your friends and relatives probably got picked up by the NKVD. They were probably in that jail. So people go ballistic. And the Germans, they really used that situation. They really drained it for everything they could. So yes, for about a week, the things that were happening there were like outrageous. It is like a kind of it says a stain that again something people have to relieve and something people need to talk about. It's like and admit, look, this what happened, but also what you know have the whole story out. Nobody has the whole story out. Nevertheless, there was even in Lviv, there were plenty of Ukrainians who were hiding Jews. It's like there's even movies about people, Poles and other partisans saving Jews from Lviv. I was seeing a story where a thief hid in the underground tunnels and he would get people in there and he saved again like a huge number of people comparatively, and Germans were using that particular case of what NKVD has done, and they were like, look, and they were trying to push it across the entirety of Ukraine. Didn't work very well. So after the first week of that, that real shock to people, it kind of came down. And if you look at history, Ukraine is the place where most of the Jews were saved. Third third country in the Second World War. It was the third country by the numbers of Jews that were saved by Ukrainian people at the risk to their own lives
Mm.
in cities and villages where they would hide them from the Germans and save them through the entire war. But one big, it's a big event. It's a horrible event. I look, I'm like I said, not super relatable to humans, but even I couldn't say
Come
like
on. Don't sell yourself in such
I
a
told
short
you
way,
I'm
my
I'm
friend.
well spoken, well read, but after these 3 hours, I'll be hiding under my blanket for 3 days. I promise you that.
Yes. It's great
No,
information, man. It's great to hear. I mean, it's
but
not the story. I
but
mean, but it's very in
if
depth.
I might imagine myself into these conditions, and I'd appreciate that there was now it's easy to be like, oh, I'm not gonna be like I wouldn't get involved with that. It's like really, you know. When was the last time your friends did something stupid and you looked at this next morning and you think, "Well, I should have never done that," and yet the day before you did, and it wasn't something as influential and as heavy hitting as the events that happened in Lviv over the first you know days of war.
It's a
Like,
huge. I mean, it's a huge topic, and it affected every one of us in Eastern Europe that was
yeah,
caught between the Nazis and the Soviets.
yeah,
And
but
yeah, go ahead.
the people who usually talk about the that Ukrainians being Nazis, their biggest reference point is this particular case. And like I said, if I had money, it's like I would to do that. I would like to make a movie about this. If it's not me, then please find somebody I'm sure there's an American or European filmmaker talented enough who could tell the stories. There's some Ukrainian filmmakers, but with good financial backing to actually tell this story, because it shows I believe it would show the people of Ukraine, you know, the everyday stuff that was happening there, but it will also show the horror of the situation people had to deal with and how it influenced them. Like like
Yeah,
same thing that happened in what was the name of the town in Ukraine? Starts from B. That
Baba Yar.
just hmm? No, no,
Baba
no,
Yar.
no. During
That
this
was.
war already,
Um,
I forgot. I shouldn't really forget things like this. Where the Russians
oh,
have
in
killed,
Bucha.
well,
In Bucha.
Bucha, yes,
Yeah, yeah,
yes,
yeah. Sorry, I thought
right,
you were
and they
talking about
killed
World War
they
II
they
still.
killed what they didn't even kill thousands; they killed hundreds, and that's how horrible it is.
Right. And people still said
Nobody,
that was fake, unbelievably.
yeah,
No, I mean
nobody
regarding the World
even,
War. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, nobody even talks about how many guys were picked off of the streets from Kherson when it was under the government, under the Russian control. Like, and the
Oh,
bad
they've
things that
been
happened
taking
there.
drones with grenades to them, and like safari style, like trying to hit civilians. It's been documented by that Kalen, Irish
Yeah,
guy, Kalen. I forget his last name, but that's another good channel people should check out. Caolan, I think is his name, Irish fella. Um,
but
it's a topic that's I think too deep for this show, but I certainly you know every country has their own scars from that, and there's never an excuse for killing Jews. Never. Um, the Anthony Polanski, who's a Jewish.
I'd like to stop you there. There is never an excuse to. There can be a reason if somebody's attacking you if you're doing a self-defense. Other than that, there is no reason to kill any of us. And
Yeah,
I'm not gonna say, I'm not gonna single Jews out. Like, if you're attacking somebody because they're gay, that's as bad as because they're Jew. Like, let's start saying that, look, aggression unwarranted unless somebody's jumping at you with the fists, starting being that guy who jumps with the fists for any reason when there's no actual attack against you should not be acceptable. Like, but obviously, saying things that, like, when people say that is the things that happened are not true, like, there's people who lived through that. There's documents, historic documents. So denying that and saying, "Oh, this has never happened. This is bad," and you're a Nazi if you talk about this, it's like, wow. Now that is also like, let's put this out there. Let's look at the reasons why this happened. Well, we spoke to you in the beginning of the program when we were saying that, look, there's been different Soviet Unions, and we have to see and talk about what was happening there. We cannot say it was just good or bad. We have to say, okay, let's look at the whole system. Let's look at what's happening there, and then, like, understand what went wrong. Like, understand the bad things. Why was it that the NKVD felt that they can just shoot thousands of people indiscriminately? Why are we not repeating? Why are we going and doing the same things now? Why are we repeating the same mistakes? But that's like, why is it that we letting Russia to, or China or somebody else invade the countries, and we just sit there like waiting? Well, maybe they'll stop there.
yep,
Like, I think World War II gave us I gave us already that lesson. We don't need to be the survivors of World War II to remember the lesson.
yeah. And Ukraine with a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister at the moment. You get Russian propaganda saying that it's a Nazi country, but no, I mean just to continue on what you're saying. I mean, I'm familiar with the stories. I mean, from when I was growing up as well. Like it's three occupations that Latvia says that we had, and I mean historians recognize we had one from the first year of terror from the Soviets in 1940, right after Poland, in this year after Poland was invaded, and just their intelligentsia was decimated, and Jews. And then we had the Nazis that came in 1941, a year after, until 44, and then the Soviets again occupied. So we had three occupations actually during World War II. And it depends on which country you're talking about, and obviously Ukraine and Belarus were, their independence movements were smoked out during the Russian Civil War, or Bolshevik Civil War, whatever you want to call it, after World War One. But the the thing that a lot of Westerners don't think about as well is the tragedies. I mean, like Jordan Peterson tries to actually, I think, I'm not a fan of him the way that he's talking about Ukraine these days, but he has made this statement that everybody thought they would be Anne Frank, right? When if today, if an injustice comes to you and dictators and mad autocrats come and tell you to, report on your neighbor, total Soviet, total Nazi thing to do. Everybody, today would like to think they'll be Anne Frank and, risk their lives and their family to hide Jews in their attic. The thing that he doesn't go far enough to say is do you know what happened to the family that housed Anne Frank in Netherlands? Do you know what happened to them when Anne Frank was caught?
Oh, don't remember, but I don't think anything good happened.
No, nothing happened to them. Nothing happened to them. The thing is, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Germany, in France, even if you were hiding Jews, generally, even if your neighbor told on you and you were found out, generally you still had a state apparatus and everything was okay. But in the occupied territories, in the Baltics, in Poland, in Ukraine, in
Yeah.
Belarus, if they found out about you and you were hiding Jews, you as well were shot in the back of the head. It's total Nazi style, total Soviet style, either way. But two just tyrannical, horrible regimes. No getting around, like I said, and no excuse ever if massacres happen around Jews specifically. But Anthony Polanski is a good Polish Jewish historian that I like reading. And, a general fact is that for all of us that are like Balts, Ukrainians, Poles, we suffered under both the Nazi
Two
and the
times, yeah.
Soviet invasions. It's a little bit different, I know, with Ukraine and Belarus, but still, with Ukraine and Belarus, Ukraine in particular, they always suffered under the Stalinist, regimes. But then the Jewish communities that specifically lived in our areas, they obviously suffered more under the Nazi regime, and you just have to leave it there at some point, And another further thing that we can talk about the Russian distortion of history is all of those archives were locked in the in the Eastern Europe and the Soviet times. They didn't want to bring any light to the fact that they collaborated with the Nazis for the first 2 years, the Soviets, with the Nazi Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They don't want to talk about that. So it was never, the secret protocols and all those secret things. The pact was public, but the secret pact to divide up all the lands and how they started World War II, that was private until like the 80s. And then still, all during the Soviet times, like while America is trying to understand World War II and how it can be so crazy and how the Nazis can get so delusional in the madness of crowds, the Soviet documents and the German documents that were captured from the Soviets, the Nazi documents, they were all locked up in Moscow and no, like hands off. Like, oh, we're not going to talk about the early times where we were collaborating. So it wasn't until the 90s where the Baltics finally started to have monuments for Jews, the Jews that died there. And still to this day, you have Soviet, misinformation about it. I saw that a Holocaust memorial event in St. Petersburg was just canceled at the end of last year, and all events still. They're blaming on COVID restrictions. They don't want anything to come up to divide away from or put attention on the horrors of the Nazi past or the past that the Soviets did collaborating with the Nazis. It's all about, our own version of how we're just, saviors of the world, even though we just kill our people and they have 25% of them have no toilets. And then let's just deflect and distract. It's like the biggest projection ever when Putin says Ukraine should be denazified and demilitarized. That is like Freud to a billionth. I mean, that is precisely what Putin needs to have happen to him, is to be denazified and
But
demilitarized.
we have to say that they still did not open the documents. Like
Now
usually
they
all
closed
those
it back up
secret
again. In the
documents.
90s, there was a
Yeah,
brief time. Now it's closed up again.
and there's like all of those documents, and not just about World War II, but about the things that have happened in Ukraine in beginning of 1930s. All the things which were happening in southern Russia, like in near Volga River, like south of Volga, the Don near Don as well. Like how many people died there? Like because that area was actually caught out by an American journalist, I believe, who traveled there. And he was like, "Hey, wait a minute! There's a famine here. There's people dying here in the like thousands." And then what the Russian government, what the Soviet government did, is they send the people who were dying in those areas, they send them to the villages in Ukraine which have died out. So it's like they like, and you don't get to speak about that a lot. This is a lot of this stuff like does not get enough time in the air. Like people go like, oh, it was just Stalin. It's like, no, it was not just one person who could tell anybody do anything.
Yeah.
Let's talk about everything else. Let's talk about everybody else. Let's let's because it's kind of very easy to say, like for example, it was just Stalin or it's just Putin or it's just this guy and it's just all his fault and we're all clean and tidy. It's like where is it? Oops, sorry.
Big lessons for today. Big lessons for
Yeah,
today there.
yeah, it's like I was like I generally in these cases I remember Japan where the Japanese minister said, no, 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 it was not the emperor, it was us. We did that. You know, the emperor didn't even talk about this. We did that. We gave him the information. We gave him this. We did that. Right? How many politicians do you know in modern days who would say that? Oh, sorry, we screwed up.
Well, certainly not
Yeah,
in Russia, and that's what they need to work toward,
yeah,
and that's the biggest problem.
yeah. It's like, and that's the thing is like, you don't get that, and because of that, like lots of things happen. They point the finger and say it was Stalin's fault, but what about everybody else?
Well, now Putin's trying to lionize Stalin as well. So, Yuri, we got to end it on a
Yeah.
positive note. What can we say positively about? I mean, it's been very interesting. Look, we've been through the whole gamut of military expats, how the locals feel, Russian soldiers, and tragedies of the past. But how can we end this on a
Well,
more positive note? What's happening?
let's look at the positive note. More young people are coming into politics. Things are changing. I mean, we can complain about Trump and Musk and his other assistant, but let's be honest, these guys, except for Trump, they still young, they're full of energy, they're gonna make mistakes, they're gonna screw up along the way, but at least they're gonna start changing. They're gonna bring alternatives, and like I say, you can't do things without screwing up. It's not gonna be perfect. We can hopefully it's gonna not gonna be as many big mistakes as we expect them to do. But we're also gonna see that around you know, the Chinese Communist Party. If you look at those again, old people's home, in China, they're probably gonna go soon, and we're gonna see the change of the generations. Our houses are gonna get cheaper for not a very good reason, unfortunately. But our houses are gonna get cheaper. So, but because we will see the older generations go. I wish our grandpas and grandmas stayed as long as they could. But with this change of generation, like so, yes, with this change of generations, we're probably gonna see the changes in the way we operate. So I think that's kind of like very probably the best thing that's gonna happen. It's not gonna happen fast enough, but in the last next, I would say, after the next 5 years, we'll probably see some very new, very unknown faces coming over. We don't know what they're gonna do. We're probably gonna have plenty to criticize them for. But this is something I personally look forward to. It's like something where people are going to see that it's possible to remove the old guard and do something new. Like I hope that in Britain, because I lived there for a long time, I hope that people in Britain are going to lead the way by using their first to the post system for many youngsters who have not been part of the parties to become independent candidates and simply as this they go two fingers up on the establishment. So yeah,
Mm.
I'm hoping that's gonna happen. I'm hoping that more young faces are gonna appear because well, we have to admit, like we already talked today, it's like a whole bunch of people who essentially gone to the stage where their sand is gonna fall out. I mean, I once said that we should keep our current politicians on a mix of cocaine and Viagra to remind them that their life exists. So I believe that's what's happening in case of Trump. Not that I held the candle, but I think that guy was going to have a heart attack but survive it because his erection pumped the blood. But other than that, we'll see that this generation is going to go. And I think this is going to bring the changes because the people who are going to come in, there'll be people who better understand the times and who can use the tools they have at their disposal far better and hopefully move us forward. Like essentially, we are very much like we were like 100 years ago when there was a Great Depression because of the mismanagement of the technologies they had available at the time. Hopefully, we'll be able to avoid those mistakes because we are in the same position where we have lots of new technologies which are really changing our lives, and we really need people who can read and understand those technologies and use them to the best of their ability. And I'm also hoping that, coming from that, there will be more Ukrainian speakers coming onto English speaking channels and
Mm.
channels which have a wider coverage that's simply like local, like Russian speaking people or like international Russian speaking people and get more introduced with this, stories of their life in Ukraine, how they operate, and introduce the Ukrainian people so that the people in the West they not they don't feel like they're helping some, I will say, faceless country. I hope that Ukraine is finally gonna get the face, or the faces it deserves. And obviously, I don't think that I'm a super good face for Ukraine, but I'm hoping that like we talked today earlier, there's plenty of good guys on the internet, the bloggers who write blogs in English. They run lots of programs in English who will become more interesting to the media in the West. And we're not talking about just the mainstream media, which, like, runs a little program somewhere on BBC Three nobody watches and listens to. But we're talking about big, like YouTube, like modern media channels, which can cover big audiences. And the Ukraine is going to get the face that it deserves, like, from the young people who were there, who are there when Ukraine is changing and can show the people that are there rather than something that, you know, is essentially non-existent at the moment.
Well, you all certainly deserve it. The Latvian president at the end of last year said that Ukrainians are not only fighting for us, they are fighting instead of us. And I can tell you that is for sure how any European that has suffered under Soviet or Nazi atrocities feels. You guys are literally on the front lines, and I hope to God that there is peace this year and a lasting peace. As I said, it's gonna be interesting to see if that can actually work, and I hope that it does. But Yuri, listen, man, this is fascinating. We really appreciate it. I appreciate it. I'm sure that our viewers do here, and you know everybody in Eastern Europe for sure, man. Northern Europe is cheering for you guys, and uh, we'll I'll put some links in the stream as well about a lot of those you know English speaking Anglo style Ukrainian or pro Ukrainian channels because I think it's important. We've got to keep getting the word out. So thank you, my friend. Really
Yeah,
great
thanks
meeting
for your
you,
time as well.
and we'll have to do it again soon then.
Hopefully, yes.
All right, we'll go
So
recover.
hopefully we're gonna get some questions from the people as well. So like,
Sure.
so then we're gonna have as well, we can look at the questions, we can structure it and try and
For
answer
sure.
them, and maybe have a bit more screen share time so that we can actually show people and look up the document, so it doesn't seem like right now we're
More
talking and we're
abstract.
saying,
Yeah.
oh look,
Sure.
yeah, but then if there's questions, we can, and we answer them, we can as well look up the details and share them so that people go like, this is not just two guys talking out of their head. We can actually go and do that. I think that would be wonderful as well.
I like it. Let's shoot for it next time. So, all right, Yuri, nearly 4 hours. Thank you, my friend.
Yeah, I was not expecting more than one, and it's just kind of, did we beat Joe Rogan?
uh, certainly beat plenty of his episodes, and this one was better for sure than any of them. So, peace,
I
my
hope.
friend. Thank you
I
so
hope.
much.
Thank you very much.
Now, go ahead. Go ahead. What were you gonna say? Were you gonna say something?
Oh, I was saying, like, I hope we were more interesting than Joe Rogan. Well, I say I think the subject did not was not the kind of subject where we could really make lots of jokes and lots of fun.
Yeah.
So, but I
Yeah.
hope we gave better information. I think
You did.
hopefully
You did,
that,
my friend. I really
and
appreciate it.
I think
Fascinating.
hopefully people will look at us and they will see that, like, there's difference in between Russians and Ukrainians, but it's also they will understand that, look, there's certain things that no matter what they do and say, because of the way situation is in Russia, unless Ukraine is given help, you know, it will not change. They will just continue coming because of the way of the poor situations the Russians are in, which again often is not being addressed.
Yeah.
Well,
Completely agree. Those are very good points, and the points about their society is going to be super important after the war. And all I can say is the West and free, loving societies need to keep up the pressure to support Ukraine. So, unlike we gave you in World War II. So, listen, thank you, my friend.
thanks for your time again,
Have a
and
great day.
thanks thanks to all the people that actually listened to us live. I don't know how many are there, but
Yeah, got about 700, so it's pretty good.
yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's. I mean, I had my channel, which I don't run it very much, and I had 30 subscribers, and now I'm talking to like 700 people. That's a huge change in the audience for me,
Even
and
for
I
me,
hope
man, I don't talk about Ukraine too much like this live, so I've really enjoyed it. And you know, we're going into the third year. Got to keep supporting you. So,
thanks from all the Ukrainians. Thank you very much.
Slava
And I said,
Ukraine. Slava Ukraine.
Heroes Slava.
All right.
Okay,
Ciao.
cool.
Ciao, man. See ya. Bye bye.